Good evening and welcome. Welcome to our new temporary surroundings. And also, if it's not too late, to wish you all a very happy new year. I'm Councillor Dennis Bennyworth, Chairman of the Western Area Planning Committee. The members of the committee joining me this evening are Councillors Phil Barnett, Jeff Cant, Caroline Culver, James Cole, Martha Vickers, Andy Moore, Claire Rolls and Howard Wollaston. The following officers are attending to advise and support the meeting. Team Leader of Western Area Planning Committee, Mr. Simon Till. Senior Planning Officer, Mrs. Lydia Mather. Our Highways Officer, Mr. Paul Goddard. Legal Advisor, Mrs. Sharon Armour. The clerk for the meeting is Mrs. Vicky Yule, and the Zoom host, Mr. Jack Karimi. Before we start, I'd like to explain for the benefit of those watching that tonight's meeting is being held both over Zoom and with councillors present and COVID compliant in the meeting area. As those present are socially distanced, they're permitted to remove their face masks while seated. Representatives making a presentation to the committee have been encouraged to do so remotely via Zoom, but those here in person are equally welcome. The meeting is also being live streamed on YouTube. Please can I ask everyone present in the meeting area to make sure that they have their microphones placed as much in front of them as possible, and ask that you make sure that you speak directly into it. If we hear the evacuation alarm this evening, we must leave the building immediately. Please proceed via the safe emergency exit route, which will be shown to us by the trained officers present, sporting their very fashionable high-vis jackets, you can notice. The assembly point is in the Market Street multi-storey car park. Anyone requiring assistance down the stairs will be assisted accordingly by the trained officers. Do members have any questions about the way in which this meeting will be conducted before we proceed? Okay, on to item one, apologies. Mrs. Yule, have we received any apologies for this evening?
Yes, Chairman. Apologies have been received from Councillors Clive Hooker, Adrian Abbs and Tony Vickers. Councillors James Cole, Andy Moore and Martha Vickers are acting as substitutes respectively.
Thank you very much. On to item two, the minutes. We have no minutes available for this evening's meeting. And then we move on to item three, declarations of interest. Do any members wish to make a declaration of interest, please? Councillor Barnett. We're very quiet there, Councillor Barnett. Can you bring your...
Is that working now?
Better, yes.
Sorry, I pressed the left and not the right. Apologies. Yes, I have a declaration of interest. In relationship to Pond Close, I'm also a member of Newby Town Council and its Planning and Highways Committee where this application was discussed. But tonight I'll weigh up all the evidence before I vote accordingly.
Councillor Barnett. Councillor Culver.
Thank you, Chairman. On the first item, I am the ward councillor for this application, and I also live in East Ilsley, which could potentially be affected by the application, but I'll make my decision based on the evidence presented this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Culver. Councillor Moore.
Could you duplicate Councillor Barnett's interest for me as well?
That's noted. Thank you, Councillor Moore. I will ask members at this point, if you'd be good enough, please, to refrain from using your physical hand and go with a virtual one. The pillar doesn't make it terribly easy to see all of you. So if we go with a virtual hand, that would help me out a great deal. No further declarations of interest, members? Okay, that brings us on then to item 4 of the agenda. For those of you who are new to the meeting, I'll explain briefly how this will work. Officers will present the application to the committee, after which the following groups might wish to make representations for a maximum of 5 minutes. They are in this order: parish and town council representatives, objectors, supporters, the applicant and or agent, and finally the ward member or members. Following this, the committee members will have the opportunity to ask questions of clarification of the speaker and officers. The committee will then debate the application and vote on the decision. Now, we have 2 applications on the agenda for this evening. The first of those being 20/01336/Outmatch. And before I ask Mrs. Mather to begin her presentation, I'd just like to thank officers for making an extraordinary site visit possible. The initial site visit was poorly attended for various reasons, and we would only have had 3 members sitting tonight that had actually been on site. And having had a subsequent site meeting, I think we can all appreciate how important that meeting was. So I'd like to minute my thanks, and I'm sure that of the committee, to officers who enabled that extraordinary site visit. Now moving on to Mrs. Mailer, if you'd be good enough, please, to start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll just share my screen. Would you mind confirming that that's working, please?
I have your, I presume your first slide, Former Institute for Animal Health, of Animal Health.
Lovely, thank you very much. The application is a hybrid application, so part full and part outline. The full application is for the demolition of all but 2 buildings, which is the gatehouse and the building in ongoing employment use, remediation of land contamination and preliminary groundworks, change of use of land, including public open space and wildlife areas. The outline application is for up to 160 dwellings, land for employment use, including that existing, and an area for future employment use. Access is for consideration as part of the outline, with all other matters reserved, which is landscaping, scale, layout, and appearance. The application is before committee where there have been more than 10 letters of objection. The designations and constraints of the site are: the site is allocated for approximately 140 dwellings. The northern part of the site, this area here, referred to as Area A, is outside of the settlement boundary. The site is partly within and adjacent to a conservation area to the south. It is wholly within the North Wessex Downs area of outstanding natural beauty. It is within flood zones 2 and 3 to the south of the site. It's within an area of archaeological interest, and there are public rights of way adjacent to the site. The demolition is proposed in 5 phases, colour-coded on the plan. The retained gatehouse building is proposed for community use, and this building is to be retained, which is in existing employment use. As noted in the report, due to the extent of demolition and remediation, these works are likely to take longer than usual at 18 months. This would be managed by a construction management scheme and further detailed contamination investigations and remediation management, including any necessary permits under separate legislation. The green infrastructure plan shows Area A to the north, with no development as a landscape buffer, wildlife habitat area, and informal open space. The cricket pitch is to be retained, as are all category and A and B trees. Landscaping, open space, and habitat areas are to the boundaries of the site, and a central green running through the centre. Those are all shown in green.
If I can just stop you there. It's just been suggested, and I was rather screwing my eyes looking at the screen. Is it possible that you can make the slide a little larger, please?
I think we have her presenter's view rather than.
See if I can do this a different way.
Chairman, if you just bear with me for a second, I'm going to see if I can assist.
Okay,
Thank you. Sorry.
Chairman, while we're waiting, there seems to be some problem with the lighting in here. It keeps coming light and then dark, and obviously has an effect on the intensity of the screen, I find. I don't know whether it's just my light or whether it's general across the whole of the room.
They do tend to go down if you don't move. So they're sort of set. So if you're sort of in the office on your own, quite often you find yourself in the dark. So I don't know if that's something to do with it. Yes, quite.
Chairman, is that working?
that's much better, Mrs. Mayor. Thank you very
My
much.
apologies. I didn't realise. Thank
Not at
you.
all. Not at all.
Are you okay for me to continue from the slide I was on?
Members?
Yeah.
Yep, please do.
Thank you. I believe I was there. Okay, so yeah, so I was discussing the landscaping and wildlife areas primarily around the boundaries of the site and in Area A. Okay, for the outline part of the application, there are parameter plans that subsequent reserve matters would need to comply with. With regard to land use, the housing would be within the yellow areas shown on this plan. Area B to the north will be developed to a lower density than Area C to the south. Area E1 is retained as the existing employment use, and A1 is the proposed employment land for future development. The access for the housing would be off High Street. The existing access for the employment use will be retained off Churn Road, and the other existing access at this point here for the proposed employment use. And on the access plans, the footpaths proposed around the perimeter of the build area through the central green and reinstate the footpath running east-west across the site, which would link to existing rights of way. The illustrative master plan wouldn't be an approved plan, but shows how 160 houses could be provided on site within the parameters of the other plans. The report outlines that over 300 objections have been received and 3 letters of support. It gives a summary of the matters raised. The parish council and adjacent parish councils object to the proposal. With regard to the principle, under the adopted policies, the site is within settlement where there is a presumption in favour of residential development. It has previously developed land, which is land identified as preferable for development. The site is identified within the AONB policy as having potential to deliver greater level of growth for a service village and is allocated for approximately 140 dwellings. The parameter plans are considered to comply with the allocation policy map. The dwellings would be within the developable areas shown as blue. They would not be within the landscape buffers shown as green. They would not be within the flood risk area or outside the settlement boundary to the north, here and here. It would retain the existing cricket ground, and area B would be developed to a lower density than area C. Objections to the principle have included loss of existing buildings, in particular the hostel buildings and nursery buildings, which are here. However, the allocation policy expects comprehensive redevelopment, and officers do not consider there to be a conflict with that policy. Objections to the principle include that the proposal for up to 160 dwellings would be major development in the AUMB, which under the MPPF should be refused. Whether a proposal is major development is a matter for the decision maker. Officers consider that in allocating the site for housing, this assessment has already taken place under the allocation policy. The allocation is approximate and not up to. The addition of 20 dwellings is not considered by officers to result in major development in the AUMB. With regard to the employment use, the allocation policy allows for replacement of employment floor space and expects employment use as part of a mixed-use redevelopment of the site. The supplementary planning document for the site outlines that market demand and the size and function of Compton are factors in the amount of floor space to be replaced on site. Policy C11 of the Compton Neighbourhood Development Plan requires the redevelopment to provide an enterprise hub preferable within an existing retained building. No new building is proposed, but as part of the whole site development, there would be a mixed use with the existing employment use retained on site. The submitted commercial market report outlines the limited or no transactions in Compton for offices and other commercial uses and considers there is not a robust demand to justify a speculative commercial building at this time. Overall, the site area for employment use would be a fifth of the developable area on site. With regard to community uses on site, the allocation policy includes community uses as part of the mixed-use redevelopment, with the cricket ground to be retained, which is also stated in the supplementary planning document, and is proposed to retain the cricket ground. The gatehouse is proposed as a community use building. As noted in the report, the building has limited existing parking associated with it, but this can be secured at reserve matters as part of the layout details. Overall, with regard to the principle, it's considered that the proposed housing for up to 160 dwellings is acceptable, and that provision has been made for employment and community uses as part of the proposal. With regard to landscape character, the allocation policy and supplementary planning document expect Area A to be restored and enhanced with all buildings and hard standing to be removed, additional woodland belt landscaping as screening, and informal recreational use on grassland to its lower levels. This is what is proposed in Area A. The council's landscape consultant is of the view 160 dwellings of mainly 2 stories in height can be accommodated on site and within the parameter plan submitted, and have an acceptable impact on the AOMB. There are some elements they would like reconsidered in a design code at reserve matter stage, and restrictions on the heights of dwellings to 2 stories with an element of 2.5 story and 1 story dwellings. The report sets out the illustrative master plan shows 160 dwellings of 23 dwellings per hectare in Area B and 26 dwellings per hectare in Area C. This complies with the allocation policy of a lower density in Area B and the SPD by not exceeding 30 dwellings per hectare. The illustrative housing mix demonstrates that it can in general comply with the council's policies and that of the Compton Neighbourhood Development Plan with primarily family-sized dwellings. 15% of dwellings are to achieve building regulations requirements for accessible and adaptable dwellings. The housing mix will otherwise be a reserve matter. Where the site is previously developed land, 30% of dwellings are required to be affordable. Part of the allocation policy and the Compton Neighbourhood Development Plan expects a local letting scheme. This is proposed as part of the development and would be secured by planning obligation. The update sheet provides further information on first homes, a type of affordable housing. It's not anticipated that this would need to be provided, but the recommendation includes first homes and the heads of terms for the planning obligation should provision of first homes become applicable. With regard to heritage, conditions are recommended by the council's archaeologist on an archaeological watching brief and building recording. The conservation officer is content with the impact on the adjacent conservation area. With regard to sustainable construction and energy efficiency, advice has been received that zero carbon can be sought from major housing development, and a condition is proposed to secure this. The Compton Neighbourhood Development Plan includes a policy for an uplift on sustainable construction under building regulations, which is proposed to be secured by planning obligation. With regards to green infrastructure, the allocation policy outlines improvements to footways onto the high street will be required, and additional pedestrian and cycle routes could be provided onto the Hockham Road, as well as within the site, and reinstatement of the east-west footpath across the site. It also requires the cricket pitch to be retained. The proposal includes a number of footpaths, including the reinstatement of the east-west footpath across the site, and would link to the wider public footpath network. Public rights of way request a contribution to upgrades required as a result of the development, as well as conditions on surfacing materials, lighting and signage for the footpaths. Public open space, as outlined in the report, retains the cricket pitch and would meet the policy requirement. Additional areas of public open space are proposed, primarily in Area C and Area A, as well as 4 areas for play and an equipped area of play. These to be secured with a planning obligation. With regard to biodiversity, ecology and protected species surveys were submitted with the application, along with a biodiversity net gain calculation. Compensation for some initial hedgerow and parkland habitat loss would be required. The strategy includes enhancements to hedgerows, woodlands, grassland, scrub, trees, amenity grassland and sustainable drainage features to provide in excess of 10% net gain in biodiversity. Mitigation and enhancements are proposed for protected species. The Council's ecologist accepts the proposals and recommends conditions as set out in the report. All category A and B trees are proposed to be retained on site. Landscaping is a reserved matter for the outline part of the application, and conditions for landscaping details are proposed for the remainder of the site. The tree officer is satisfied with the proposal subject to conditions. In terms of land contamination and noise, the allocation policy includes that a contamination report and preliminary risk assessment are required, which have been submitted. There are contaminants on site, with the Environment Agency noting previous activities include landfill, hydrocarbon storage, animal disposal and incineration, and research. The submitted land contamination report identifies potential contamination from made ground, including areas where accommodation buildings are located. The report further recommends ground investigations after demolition to ascertain any contamination within the building footprints so that remediation can occur before and as part of the subsequent development. The Environment Agency agrees with the submitted reports that further intrusive investigations are required and groundwater quality established. They recommend conditions on a remediation strategy, verification report on remediation measures, and no infiltration of surface water to the ground. The Council's Environmental Health concur with the Environment Agency on land contamination. Environmental Health also note that the employment use on site may emit noise that could affect future residents and recommend a condition on a noise mitigation scheme. Conditions are also recommended on construction management and hours of work to protect local residents as much as possible from disturbance during the works. With regard to flooding, the allocation policy requires a flood risk assessment and no development within the flood zones on site or below a certain ground level. The applicant undertook detailed flood modelling, which was submitted and consulted upon. As a result, the Environment Agency are now satisfied that with conditions on finished floor levels, no raising of existing ground levels, and no infiltration drainage measures, that the flood risks of the development are acceptable. Thames Water advised there is currently insufficient capacity of the foul and water infrastructure. They require a condition limiting development until sufficient infrastructure is provided. Thames Water have confirmed they are in discussions with the applicant to provide the necessary infrastructure. Where Thames Water are a statutory undertaker, they have permitted development rights, so these works would not fall under this planning application. With regard to highways, Highways England were consulted and raised no objection with regard to their interest of the junction at East Ilsley to the A34. The Highways officer will be able to provide more information, but in summary, they require amended plans to demonstrate sight lines for the access off the high street can be achieved. In terms of traffic generation and traffic modelling, Highways are satisfied the proposal is acceptable. With regard to the Compton Neighbourhood Development Plan, the report outlines that it carries considerable weight. If it passes the referendum scheduled for the 10th of February, it would become an adopted plan of the council and carry full weight. If it does not pass the referendum, it would not be adopted and would not carry weight. With regard to overall compliance with the Compton Neighbourhood Development Plan policies, officers consider that it complies with 14 of the policies considered applicable to this site. It does not comply with C4, but there is with regard to district heating provision on site, but there is a condition recommended for carbon savings as part of the development to achieve zero carbon. It does not comply with policy C6 to retain the hostel and refurbish it for 1- and 2-bedroom homes, but the redevelopment across the site would provide a proportion of smaller homes. It does not comply with policy C11, where it does not propose an enterprise hub, although it does propose retention of an area of land on site for future employment use. Those are the remaining policies which I've outlined are either not proposed, achieved by condition, or part of the planning obligation heads of terms outlined in the report. As set out in the report, the proposal is considered overall to comply with policy. Some adverse impacts have been identified with regard to size and location of the building proposed for community use, the estimated 18-month period of works for demolition and its impact on residents, where works on site would be longer than normally expected, and the constraints of the site due to previous land contamination and consequently land drainage. However, the benefits of the proposal are considered to outweigh these impacts, in particular the provision of housing on an allocated housing site, including affordable housing, housing which is accessible and adaptable, remediation of the land contamination on site, economic benefits during and after construction, public open space, public rights of way, and a net gain in biodiversity. Overall, the application is recommended for approval, subject to the conditions and legal agreement as set out in the report. The report outlines, in the event of a resolution to grant permission, officers will request confirmation whether the Secretary of State wishes to call in the application for their determination, where we have been notified of a call-in request to them. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm now going to move on to highways. Mr. Goddard. Mr. Goddard, do you have any comments you'd like to make on this application, please?
I can do. Thank you, Chairman. The highways section of the report is from page 45 for your reference. The planning officer has lifted what we had to say pretty much word for word, so it's quite detailed. But I will summarise it for you. As Mrs. Mather just mentioned, the planning application before you was outlined with only access being considered. There is an existing access onto the high street, which is acceptable with regards to width, geometry and sight lines, although some further detail regarding the sight lines is required, but we're sure that it can be achieved and it's being secured by condition. There is other accesses onto Churn Road that serve the existing commercial premises, some of which are being retained within the proposal. Also, the accesses onto Churn Road will also act as an emergency access because overall this site is a cul-de-sac. Mrs. Mather mentioned the pedestrian routes from the site and through the site, the public rights of way, which are acceptable to us. The transport assessment assessed the proposal as if there was nothing there. Clearly, the site has an existing use, and we suspect, and in fact, we're very confident, that the existing or consented uses of the site would have had a higher level of traffic generation than the proposal before you tonight. But nevertheless, the transport assessment assessed it as if there was no existing traffic movements from the site. And the area was surveyed extensively, a whole list of junctions, and they were all modelled using traffic modelling software. And none of the junctions were found to have any traffic capacity issues. And this included the junctions onto the A34 at East Ilsley, which has led to Highways England not raising any objection. It also needs to be pointed out that the traffic modelling was on the basis of a much larger scheme that's before you tonight. It was based on 250 dwellings. Obviously, during the planning process, the size of the scheme was reduced to 160 dwellings, which is before you tonight. There will be, as covered in the Section 6 head of terms, some off-site highway works for pedestrian improvements, pedestrian crossing points, etc., to ensure that pedestrians can walk from the site comfortably, conveniently to the existing footway network within Compton. There will also be a £5,000 contribution towards the council being able to monitor the travel plan, which is required for any residential development of this size. And therefore, Chairman, on this basis, subject to the conditions that Mrs. Matham mentioned just now, your highway officers have no objection to this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goddard. Okay, now we're going to move on now to our representatives from Compton Parish Council. Mr. Karimi, can I ask you to invite those members to join us, please? Mr. Karimi, if you can confirm when all of our guests have joined us, please.
There's one in, two are, I think are still considering the invite.
I've got Mr. Fred Quartermain on screen. Good evening, Mr. Quartermain.
Good evening.
Just waiting on a few councillors to join us. Just bear with us one moment, please. Good evening, councillors. I've got Alison Strong and Ian Tong. Can you both hear me? You're both on mute, incidentally.
Yep, I can hear you.
And if you'd like to reveal yourselves to us and enable your videos.
This is Councillor Alison Strong. We have Fred Quartermain, who will be our agent for the parish council. The other parish councillors here are supporting him with to answer any questions that might come from the members. But Fred is our legal representative this evening.
Okay, Councillor Strong, would you be good enough to, if possible, start your video? Or...
Yeah, I am trying to.
Ah, okay. And there you are. Wonderful. Okay, so you're all here. That's great. Just to explain, you have 5 minutes to make your presentation. That's 5 minutes in total between the four of you. After 4 minutes, I'll give you notice, should you require it. And then with 10 seconds to go, I will say, and in conclusion, and then I'll ask you to stop. When you're ready, I'll just bear with me one moment. I'll start the clock. And when you're ready, please begin.
Good evening. I'm Fred Quartermain and I'm instructed by Compton Parish Council and speak on their behalf this evening. The Parish Council has maintained an objection to the scheme throughout. The objections are set out in the report before you and I won't simply repeat what they are. Instead, I want to emphasise a number of key issues. The first issue is that this is simply the wrong development for this site. The site is an allocated site and that allocation is for 140 units. Here we are discussing an application which significantly exceeds this. The magnitude of the difference changes the impacts of the proposed development on the existing community in Compton and does so in a fundamental way. The Parish Council and residents of the village have, in good faith, engaged with the planning system. They've seen the site allocated for an appropriate size of development, and they've prepared a neighbourhood development plan, which has passed examination and is going to referendum, which deals with the site. The proposals here simply ride roughshod over that work. The Parish Council recognise that this site is in the right location for the right development of the right size. The statutory development plan sets that size at 140 units. Larger developments are only allowed where it can be demonstrated that there is no harm. There's been no demonstration here. 140 units must be considered to be the level of development which strikes the right balance between viability and balanced growth. Even at 140 units, the development of the site will present a challenge in terms of integration with the existing community. At the size proposed, those challenges are simply insurmountable. This is the textbook definition of unbalanced growth. Units are shoehorned onto a site with no thought to the character and function of the existing village, and there's been no justification for those additional units. The reward for the Parish Council for engaging with the planning system, agreeing and accepting what is in context a significant allocation and seeing it through into a neighbourhood plan, which builds on that policy, is to have all that work ignored and for inappropriate development to be supported by the council officers. This cannot be right and significantly undermines public faith in the planning system. It's apparent that the current scheme does not accord with the adopted development plan, and it should be refused for that reason alone. The Parish Council's concerns go beyond the size of the scheme. The details, such as they are, also represent a significant missed opportunity. The proposed development sees the demolition of the existing community facilities, which are highly valued by the existing residents of Compton. These facilities are dismissed as unviable, but in fact were closed down because the site was closed to the public, not because they weren't being used. The facilities were purpose-built and could be reinstated. So whilst the development could see these community facilities restored and improved, instead they're removed and what is remains is diminished. This should not be allowed. The loss of these facilities without suitable replacements is clearly contrary to policy and should lead to the proposals tonight being refused. Next, I want to touch on the history of the site. As a scientific facility which routinely dealt with infectious diseases and livestock. The result of this planning history is that there is a high probability of significant contamination issues. These contamination issues are broadly dismissed in the officer's report as being dealt with by condition. Whilst a normal suite of brownfield land conditions are proposed as if this site was any other industrial site with an industrial history, that's not the case. The Parish Council are clear that the conditions proposed in relation to contamination do not go far enough. They need to be strengthened at least to provide further safeguards for existing residents and for the benefit of future occupiers. The Parish Council's local knowledge also highlights issues around traffic and access to the site. The conclusion that traffic, and particularly construction traffic, can safely mix with the existing traffic in Compton, particularly school traffic, which clogs the roads on any morning, is so far removed from the lived reality of residents that it's difficult to see the reports that have been submitted as robust.
That's 1 minute, please.
Thank you, sir. The fact that the surveys that inform this position are over 4 years old only emphasises the flimsy nature of the conclusions that has been drawn on them. There is a clear traffic risk here. In summary, this development is of the wrong scale. It is fundamentally in conflict with the adopted development plan, and it does not provide suitable mitigations. It should be refused. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm now going to move to members to ask any questions of clarification from our Compton Parish Council, please. I've got Councillor Culver first.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Quartermain, for joining us this evening, and thank you, councillors. I've got 3 questions, if I may. You mentioned the number of houses not meeting the allocation in the local plan, and that it wouldn't sit well with the current nature of the village. Can you expand a bit on that, perhaps about the housing mix? Why do you think it doesn't fit very well with the rest of the village? And also about the contamination. Why do you think this contamination is different to the usual kind of brownfield industrial sites that one might wish to redevelop? And you also mentioned road safety as well. It was mentioned by Mr. Goddard that he didn't see a road safety issue because people used to walk to the, because people used to drive into the site. So what is the difference between that and having people drive in as residents? So if you could, or the councillors could expand upon that, that would be good. Thank you.
Of course, I suggest that I will answer your question on the allocation, and I'll let the councillors with their local knowledge talk about the contamination issues and the highways issues. On the allocation, the site is allocated for 140 units. That has been assessed through the adoption of the local plan as the appropriate size of development for this site. The details of the housing mix are all reserved matters at this stage, so they're not something that is before you, but the allocation policy, which is quite clear at setting a limit at 140 unless an applicant can demonstrate that there is no risk to creating a segregated or a community which is separate to the existing village, and there has been no documents submitted along with the application which demonstrate that 160 units is an appropriate scale. Or certainly no documents that have been made publicly available. There have been some viability documents submitted, but those have not been released to the public, and so I can't comment on their content.
Thank you, Mr.
And the other
Quartermain.
2 questions, Chairman. Sorry, do you want me to repeat them?
If you would, you're directing the parish councillors, I think, now. aren't
Yes,
you? Yeah.
yes.
Please
So
do.
yeah, about the contamination, Mr. Quartermain said that it was different to usual brownfield industrial site redevelopment. And I wonder if you could expand upon why you think it's different. And also about the road safety issue, Mr. Goddard said that he was not concerned because vehicles would have driven into the site when it was being used. So if you could expand upon that, please.
So I could talk a little bit about the contamination that, and I may, Councillor Pinfold may be able to chip in with this as well. I think it's really important to be very clear that this site was the Institute for Animal Health that from the 1930s onwards did research into infectious diseases. So that includes things from all animals, from bovine to chickens, would included things, salmonella, I want to call it mad cow disease, but I know that's not the technical term for it. Sorry, but the technical term escapes me for a second. But and it was a high level of research. I have lived in the village all of my life, so that's all 53 years of it, and I have experienced personally and witnessed the levels of contamination through into the village over that time, which had to be remediated. So I think that the local knowledge is that we are aware that there will be considerable levels of infectious type materials which will have been disposed of on the site prior to there having been rigorous and robust legal regulations around such materials. So I think it's about what has happened in the past and historically what will be buried on site. And there is a high level of concern across the village on that. I mean, maybe Councillor Pinfold, you'd be able to add any more comments to that.
I think the only thing to add is it's not just the infectious materials.
Councillor Pinfold, can you recap there? We rather lost you for a moment.
Sorry, it's not just the infectious materials, it's also the radioactive materials that were used on site. And as local people, we're sort of aware that the records aren't the most robust.
Thank you very much. Councillor Culver, does that answer question number 2? And your third question regarding highways.
Yeah, so I think it's important to set the scene. So the village as it stands today grew around the Institute, and many of the housing that's in the village belonged to the Institute. So when you took a job at the Institute, it came with a house. In later years, Sovereign Housing took on the accountability of these houses, but the employees remained within the housing. So therefore, it's not true to say that the level of traffic coming into the village to service the site when it was a working commercial site would be higher than that of the proposed development, because predominantly people walked to work. and it was a known thing that people walked to work, they came home for lunch, they went back to work, and they finished at 5 o'clock. And there was a very set standard of hours kept at the Institute. And as I say, most people walked. Even the directors at the Institute all brought properties within the village. So they were really embedded in the community. So I think that the assumption made by Hayways is incorrect. And the concern around the traffic now, especially around the demolition and the build. So what you have to remember about Compton is that it has the Down School in Compton, which is the comprehensive school for all of the villages around. So it is serviced by many coaches that come in the morning and many parents bringing their children in, because now with the cost of over £700 a year to pay for your coach, parents are now bringing their children into school. So every morning from 8 o'clock onwards, we have high levels of traffic in the village coming in from all entrances into the village to go to the schools. So that's twice a day we have that. And we do also already have industry, because I think some comment was made about us not having much industry. So yes, we do have other industry. We have a business park, which has a traffic going to it. And we also have Baxter Healthcare, which is a big corporate in the village that also has traffic, all coming in at the similar time of day. So I think there will be a heavy impact on the village roads from this development.
Councillor, thank you very much. I'm going to turn now to Councillor Barnett.
Question to Mr. Quatermain. Good evening, Mr. Quatermain. You mentioned the facilities being purpose-built. Obviously, as members, we've had the pleasure of going round the site and looking at the various buildings. And some, I must admit, I was quite impressed with the standard of brickmanship regarding the obviously high-quality builders that were involved. But in regarding the comments you made about purpose-built for the facility that was there before, what were you advocating it could be used other than the purpose-built when it was built? What were you think? What was your mindset in regarding when you said it could be used for other purposes?
Thank you, Councillor. You have won over on me in that you have seen the site and visited it. So I can talk from a desktop assessment, and my understanding is that the community facilities that exist on the site are purpose-built as community facilities, and that can cover a range of uses, as I'm sure you're aware. The suggestion that the gatehouse can be kept and turned into a community facility when the existing facilities are lost is a lowering in the quality of the facilities that are available, and a missed opportunity to enhance the facilities that are there already, and that's the point I was trying to make.
Councillor Barnett, does that answer your? Chairman. Councillor Barnett, is your microphone on? Please?
Yes, okay. It's obviously perhaps an appropriate question, but probably incorrect for me to have asked Mr. Quatermain. I thought your indication was that you'd actually knew what the buildings were like inside, and of course we didn't have the pleasure. But obviously your assumption is that they were purpose built. Yes, correct. At the time of when the facilities were in being used. Chairman, would I be able to ask a question? Another supplementary which came out from Becca Pinfold, and I'd like to just explore that if I could. She mentioned about radioactive materials, which of course my past knowledge working in the nuclear industry, a little bit astounded me a bit, because I would have expected it to have been sealed sources which would have been removed from site. Can you just elaborate what you meant by radioactive sources on site, or in this case, I think you meant use the word contamination?
I believe there is a report that highlights where there are radioactive materials buried in pots on site. However, because of our local knowledge, we're aware that people that used to work there were sort of phone called and asked if they knew where certain things had been buried or could remember certain procedures. So our concern as the parish council is that what they may think they know is there is probably not all of what is there.
Okay. All right.
Thank you, Councillor Barnett. Councillor Williston.
Can I just, thank you, Chairman. Can I just extend a little bit further Councillor Barnett's question? And you mentioned there were community facilities there. I say I'm walking around, I didn't see any at all. I'd just like to know what they are.
As I understand it, they were closed when the site was shut down. But
sorry, what were they there?
So we had there was a social club, a bar, a social club, the pavilion, which also formed part of the pavilion for the cricket pitch. I would just like to point out, everybody refers to this as a cricket pitch. Historically, it was a cricket pitch. It is no longer fit for cricket. It is a green field, which has been severely damaged, and it would take a considerable amount of investment to think you could play cricket on it again. So while it's known as the cricket pitch, it's not seen a ball or some wickets for a very long time. There was also a nursery called Piglets, and this was open to the village. So predominantly the employees had the opportunity to have their children at the nursery, and then it was open up wider for the whole village to use. So yeah, it was a commercial children's nursery. And then obviously there were the hostels, and previously in historically there'd been a squash court as well. I don't know whether Becca Pinfield could expand any more on that.
So the views of the local parish is that they would like to retain the Pickled Pig, which was the nursery, as the current preschool is at its limits, and then the Pickled Pig is the bar, and that's been highlighted as somewhere that could be used as a business hub. And could be reinstated as the social club for the community. It also provides the changing rooms and the toilet facilities for the cricket pitch. So as Councillor Strong said, it's not viable as a cricket pitch unless you have the associated pavilion with it. Mm-hmm. And they are the buildings that the community would like to retain. Being offered the gatehouse isn't as viable. It's going to be on the only access to the site, the only vehicle access. It's not particularly big, and it's actually in the designated flood zone. So the community would like to see the other purpose-built buildings retained over the gatehouse.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Woods, does that answer your question, Councillor Woods?
Thank you, Chairman. Yep.
Okay, I'm going to move on to Councillor Moore, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to go back to the housing density question. The report we have in front of us says that it meets policy and comments that the Compton neighbourhood development plan discusses density but doesn't set any parameters for it. Could you expand a little on why it is that you feel that 160 is too much and 140 is okay?
I can certainly try and expand upon what I've already said. As I'm sure you're aware, that the council has gone to great lengths to adopt policies which set allocations as for sites which are appropriate for the size and scale of development that can be supported on the site. And the allocation for this site was for 140 units, unless it could be demonstrated that more could be accommodated without causing damage to the community. It is that number, that 140, that is carried forward into the neighbourhood plan. What we have here is an application for 160, which is a significant increase on 140, and there is no justification for that increase. It may be that we're, in terms of densification, there's no wording in the policy that says it should be less dense than is being proposed. But as I said in the answer to the earlier question, the details are reserved matters at this stage. It's the principle we're talking about here, and at a high level principle point of view, there is a clear allocation that says 140 units is the maximum that can be supported unless it is demonstrated otherwise. The onus is put upon the developer to demonstrate, and the developer just simply hasn't done that.
Thank you, Mr. Quartermain. I had Councillor Rolls. You're out, Councillor Rolls?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, and my point was around the community assets, which has already been raised. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Culver.
Thank you, Chairman. I have a couple of questions. Am I right in thinking that you mentioned the construction traffic? That's to Mr. Quartermain.
That was mentioned, yes.
Yes, yes. I think the interaction of large construction vehicles and, as Mrs. Strong referred to, with the school traffic is a particular concern, and of more concern than the resident traffic.
That the parish council has accepted that there should be a development here at 140. I can't see there'll be that much less construction traffic at 140. So I'm surprised that the parish council is objecting to the construction traffic.
If I may, I think that both this particular branch of the objection and indeed the contamination objection are objections that go to the strength of the conditions that are being imposed rather than actually the principle of the development. The objections which attack the principle of the development relate to the allocation on the site and the way the site is being used, and the missed opportunity in relation to the community facilities.
I understand that. But there's been quite a lot of talk about the contamination side. Now, I'm getting the feeling that on the contamination, I'm imagining village children able to get into that site. I know the security, but everything we've been told this evening has me imagining village children able to get in and rootle around amongst that contamination. Why am I wrong?
So I don't think it's ever been brought to the parish council's attention that children have been in. It would be true that activists have been in, but the other thing that potentially is keeps people on their toes is that the site over recent years has been used for military training and police training. So it's often there are often a lot of police presence on site. They do shooting training there currently.
Cole, does that answer?
No, I've got one or two more, if I may, Chairman.
Please do.
One of you mentioned traffic in the schools. I'm imagining that a new development like this, particularly where the housing is intended, there will be a lot of families. And in fact, the traffic from the schools will, over time, divert to come from within the site. Why should that not be the case?
I think what we're talking about is traffic exiting the site and exiting the village for work purposes, being at a similar time as we have high levels of traffic entering the village for schools and work. So it's small country lanes that have to pass through another small historic village of East Ilsley to get access to the A34. Hampstead Norris is at the other side, and Aldworth, all very small lanes. So I think there are two elements to this. The parish council have concerns and wish to see conditions around timings of construction and demolition traffic. And then obviously there is the wider of when highways say they don't fill, there will be a significant impact on the village. I think that is, we feel as a parish council that's slightly misguided, that there will be an impact because you have traffic leaving at the same time as we have high levels of traffic coming in. So there will be impact on our roads as they are today, which are small country roads.
I see.
Councillor Cole, you have a supplement?
Thank you, Chairman.
You're done. Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Rolls, you are in again and out again, I think.
Everybody keeps thinking of my questions, Chairman, but thank you very much. No, it's been answered.
Thank you very much. Councillors, Mr. Quartermain, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for attending. Mr. Crimmy, if I can ask you to accompany them back into the waiting room. And invite, when you can, Mr. Andrew Sharp of the adjoining parish of East Ilsley. Mr. Sharp, good evening. Can you hear me? You're on mute and your video is off currently. I think we've got you there now. Can you hear me okay? We can't hear you, sir. Could you move a little closer to the microphone? No, Mr. Sharp, we haven't got your sound at the moment. You're showing up as muted here currently, and now I'm muted. No, I'm afraid is your microphone up above your head at the moment? The microphone on your headset, is that is that any better? Mr. Sharp, I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to go across to. We have we have some objectors. Or we have an objector rather. If I go to the objector first, if you're happy with that arrangement, give you a chance to sort out the technical problems, and then we'll come back to you in the fullness of time. Thank you very much, Mr. Karimi. If you'd ask Mr. Sharp, or take Mr. Sharp rather, to the waiting room and invite Mr. Simon Alcock, please. Mr. Alcock, good evening to you. I've got a picture. Can I hear your voice, please, sir?
Good evening, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Can you hear me okay?
We can indeed, I'm glad to say. Mr. Alcock, you have, as you've just seen, you have 5 minutes to speak, a maximum of 5 minutes to speak. I'll give you fair warning at 4 minutes, and then with 10 seconds left, I'll just give you time to wrap up. So when you're ready, I'll start the clock. Bear with me one moment. If you're ready, sir, please begin.
Thank you very much. So my name is Simon Alcock, and I live on Tithe Barn Close, which immediately borders the south of the Institute site. So I'm generally in favour of site redevelopment, but I'm extremely worried about the wastewater management and its impact on the village. So over the past 4 years of living here, we've personally suffered a number of flooding issues, including sewage re-entering our house. This is due to the high groundwater levels and inadequate drainage infrastructure within the village. So currently, there's not enough capacity within the existing network to be able to adequately support homes in the village, and I'm worried that this would be even worse with the extra demand. So specifically, I'm concerned about the location and ongoing maintenance of the proposed sustainable drainage systems, so-called SUDs, at the south of the site, one of which would immediately border our property. And it's actually at higher elevation than many nearby houses. So in the plans, I know that the SUDs are to be lined to prevent water infiltrating into surrounding grounds. And as several people have mentioned, potentially the ground is contaminated with biological, chemical, and possibly even radioactive materials. So my question is that the SUDs will have, the linings will have likely degrade over time. And I'm concerned about water management. So who would be responsible, for example, to regularly inspect and maintain the SUDs throughout their lifetime to ensure that the suds weren't damaged, and if they were to overflow or to put the wastewater into sort of downhill into all of the housing estate, that would lead to, aside from the water flooding, potential contamination coming into the families nearby. So they were my concerns. Would it be possible to address some of those concerns now or in subsequent discussions, please?
Well, thank you, Mr. Alcock. Those are questions that members might like to ask, questions of clarification of officers a little later, once we've heard from all of our representatives this evening. The questions, I'm sure, have been noted. Members will be scribbling them down, and I'm sure they'll be putting those questions to our officers. You're well inside your time there, Mr. Alcock. There's nothing further you'd like to add?
No, thank you. Just clarification, if possible, on those questions.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to go now to questions of you, if you don't mind, from Councillor Culver.
Hello, thank you for coming this evening, Mr. Alcock. You mentioned sewage. Could you elaborate a bit on that, exactly what has happened and maybe the frequency of it, and whether you've got any concerns about flooding in the past? Have you got any examples you can give us?
Yes, so we've been living in these are new build houses. We've been living here now for just over 3 years. And in that time, we've had at least 2, if not 3 floods where the sewage pipes have been blocked because of struggles within the capacity. And we've actually had sewage sort of traveled back up the pipes into our house and flooded our house. And on one occasion, we actually had water coming in, bizarrely, through the first floor roof, because we drained a bath from the upstairs ceiling, from the upstairs bathroom. It had travelled down the pipe, all the pipes were blocked, and that water found its way back into the house and flooded through the roof into the lounge below. So there's been several instances like this, and we've been. My wife had a hotline to Thames Water and the relevant people, and they had multiple vans here trying to clean out all of the drains, and they had on a daily basis they had multiple container trucks taking water and sewage away to try to clear the backlog, if you will. So it's something that we're very worried about. But to be honest, I think we're more worried about the suds. If the suds were to be damaged over time, and if it was to contain contaminated water, we're very worried about that level.
Thank you, Mr. Alcock. Councillor Culver, does that answer your question? Members, any further questions of Mr. Alcock, please? I see no further hands, sir. Thank you very much indeed for your time this evening. And Mr. Karimi, if you'd take Mr. Alcock back into the virtual waiting room. Thank you very much indeed. We'll go back, please, if we can, Mr. Karimi, to Andrew Sharp, please, of East Ilsley Parish. Hopefully we have a little more luck this time. Mr. Sharp, you're back up on screen now and unmuted. Could we hear your voice, please, sir? It seems as though we can't. Just bear with me one moment, please. I'm going to ask some advice here. Technical support. If Mr. Sharp were to log out and maybe back in again, would that be a suggestion?
He could try that.
Mr. Sharp, we're going to leapfrog you again, and if you'd be good enough to do that, hopefully we'll have better luck third time around, if that's okay. But we will come back to you.
Chairman, sorry to interrupt. Is it worth him dialing in on a mobile phone as well? That's another option.
There's another possibility. We can give it one more go on the video. Yes. Okay. Okay. Mr. Alcock, if you're still there, I'd suggest trying. I'm sorry, I do apologise. do apologise, Mr. Sharp. We'll wait for him to come back on. Members, I do apologise. Just give us a moment to try and get this sorted out. I have to say, a new temporary room with all the new technology. It's a shame that we should have been brought down by this, but there we are.
So we're moving on to the.
I've just taken advice on that, Councillor Williston, and we're going to. I think it's preferable if we hear from the parish, the adjoining parish first.
I think just to give you some clarification, I think my reasoning was ideally I'd like to try with Mr. Sharp first because there's an order of people to speak and normally the applicant goes last. I think if Mr. Sharp doesn't work this time, then we'll obviously have to consider that, but I'd rather give him one more chance to come online, either by, what he's obviously doing, logging off, logging back in, or perhaps dialing in. I think there must be something wrong with his microphone, but it quite often happens, doesn't it, on Zoom? We're just very lucky it hasn't happened that often at committees. Do we know if he's come back in yet?
Screamy.
He hasn't yet.
Chairman, could we remind him of the dial-in details for the phone, perhaps on email, or just to give him that opportunity?
Mrs. Yules, do you have a contact for Mr. Sharp? Thank you very much.
He's coming in now.
Thank you very much.
Can you hear me?
Ah, Mr. Sharp, there you are. We can hear you. If you could enable your video.
Yeah, one second. I've just swapped machines and that seems to have worked.
It does indeed, Mr. Sharp. Thank you very much. Mr. Sharp, we're going to kick on now because we've used up a little time there. Your 5 minutes, however, is not affected. And I will start the clock, please, when you are ready.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, councillors. Thank you for allowing us to present our objection to the proposed housing development of Compton. My name is Andrew Sharp. I'm the Vice Chair for the East Ilsley Parish Council. East Ilsley lies 2 miles to the northwest of Compton, accessed via the Ilsley Road. The Downs Schools, as we've heard, serves as the secondary school for the majority of our children, and Compton Village Stores is the only frequently used store within many, many miles for any kind of grocery item. The 6A bus travels between the two villages 4 times a day, and we enjoy a close alliance with each other on many issues. Since 2020, the council has strongly objected to the proposed development, and this evening we continue to object to this application. The environmental statement submitted in support of the application has assessed the impact of the existing physical below ground site conditions, including biological and radioactive contamination, and the implications upon the proposed development. This has been supported by preliminary site assessment work, which has identified various sources of contamination which present a moderate to high risk on the site. It is highly likely that any contaminated items that are collected prior to building work starting will be transported via East Ilsley as the main route to the A34, potentially depositing contaminated items as they pass through. We support the requirement for a full and detailed remediation strategy, including long-term monitoring and maintenance, and requests that in the event that any planning permission be granted, this strategy is fully implemented and carefully monitored. Whilst the principle of a residential development on the site is deemed broadly acceptable up to the level set out in the allocation, despite a reduction in the number of units from 250 to 160, the additional dwellings proposed over the allocation is absolutely not. No robust and valid justification for this increase has been provided, and the resultant harm that will arise from these additional dwellings and the unspecified employment provision is not outweighed by the need and is therefore not justified. Also, the proposed mix of housing on the site pays little regard to local needs identified in the Compton Neighbourhood Plan, Area Development Plan Policy 5 of the core strategy, which deals with settlements in the AONB, states that a limited level of development will be accommodated to meet local needs, including employment, housing, amenity and community facilities, to maintain the area as vibrant, balanced communities with their own sense of identity. East Ilsley considers that a balance needs to be struck between the potential of the site for development on the basis that it comprises brownfield land and the fact that any proposal respects the location of the site, as well as being compatible with the presiding character of the surrounding village. Whilst the application asserts that the proposals will have a negligible impact upon the highway network, we are particularly concerned about the localised impact of any increase in traffic on the network in East Ilsley and the resultant highway safety. The route from the A34 to Compton is through East Ilsley, which has a one-way system and houses very, very close to the road, few pavements, elderly residents and a primary school. Up to 280 HGVs could pass through during the demolition and build, and 160 houses could attract at least 2 cars per household, which is a further 320 vehicles in the area and presents huge concerns to the environment and the biodiversity of the area. Heading out of the village towards Compton, only one vehicle can pass through a narrow pinch point, which presents queues at peak times already. The scale of additional housing would heavily impact on already congested area in our village. The main route through the village lies within a conservation area with many houses and buildings being of significant historical importance. Due to the proximity of the buildings to the road, there is limited, if any, opportunity for road widening or the addition of payments to mitigate the situation. And
That's
some of these
1 minute, Mr. Sharp.
And some of these buildings are regularly struck with coaches, mirrors and things as they go through. The proposed development, even at reduced numbers of units, will generate increased traffic, potential for congestion and conflict between pedestrians and vehicles, a wholly unsafe pedestrian environment, contrary to the design objectives of policy CS14. Traffic conditions are considerably worse when there are problems on the A34, which all comes through East Ilsley. And whilst this is not a matter of proposed development to address, it must be acknowledged that any proposals will result in additional traffic will exacerbate the congestion. In addition, when traffic queues in East Ilsley, especially in more confined locations, there are increased levels of air pollution from vehicle fumes, poor air quality results. The safety of the local environment for increased traffic and the potential for conflict between vehicles and pedestrian will not result in a safe environment.
And in conclusion, sir?
And in summary, we object on the grounds that the proposed development fails to take account of the wider impact that will arise, as well as the impact upon the character and appearance of our conservation area.
Much indeed. Thank you very much.
Sorry about that.
Thank you. We got there in the end, Mr. Sharp.
Yeah, sorry.
Members, questions, Mr. Sharp. Councillor Barnett, please.
Through you, Chairman. Mr. Sharp, you mentioned the estimated number of vehicles that you thought might well be coming along the road towards East Ilsley, including construction vehicles. Can I ask you, when the site was fully operational a few years ago, and obviously there was a large number of employees, were a majority of those employees travelling from or through East Ilsley off the A34 or back on the A34?
That, to be honest, is not my belief. And I walk my dog every day along Fiddler's Lane, which accesses the A34. I have seen little or no decrease in the traffic since the Institute closed, which would fit in with the Compton Parish Council view that lots of people who worked at the Institute lived in Compton. So, you know, I would have expected a dramatic decrease as the Institute closed. I've seen none. And with effectively this huge employer being turned into a residential development, effectively every person living there who works will have to drive somewhere. for their work.
Thank you, Mr. Sharp. Councillor Rolls.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Sharp. Just following on from the sort of you're highlighting the profile of the traffic and the weight of the traffic. I note that Meadow Farm is quite near to the development, and presumably quite a few other farms around in the surrounding areas. Do you consider, with your local knowledge, that that has an impact as well on the level of traffic and sort of particularly sort of larger vehicles going through these villages?
I think as someone who's lived here for 20 years nearly, you sort of accept that the harvesting and things like that, the big vehicles going through is one of the things that you get with living where residents live. But it still causes problems, because when you've got a pinch point going through East Ilsley just before you get to the pond, where, as I said, there's one building regularly struck by wing mirrors of large vehicles, and you can only get one big vehicle through at a time. The farm vehicles already cause the problem before you add the construction traffic, before you add these 320 cars of new residents. So you cannot increase, there isn't a footpath, there isn't room for the footpath through this pinch point on either side. There are no footpaths. So how could you possibly believe that isn't going to impact on the traffic, adding 320 cars? It's ridiculous.
Thank you. Councillor Rose, does that satisfy
Yes,
your
thank you, Chair.
curiosity? Members, any further questions, please? Mr. Sharp, we got there in the end. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for your patience.
No, thank you. And Mr. Creamy, if you take Mr. Sharp back into the waiting room. We now come on to the applicant and agent and/or agent. We have Mr. Mike Harris, Richard Green, and Jim Strike, hopefully joining us shortly.
They're just loading, but they've all accepted.
Thank you very much, Mr. Karimi. I have Mr. Mike Harris with his video on. Messrs. Strike and Green, could you unmute yourselves and there we are, and enable your videos. Thank you very much. Gentlemen, good evening. Thank you very much for attending this evening. As you will understand, you have 5 minutes between you to address the committee. The time will start when you're good and ready, and after that, members may like to ask questions of clarification based on your presentation and that alone, okay? Your 5 minutes will start now.
Good evening. Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to speak this evening. My name is Mike Harris. I'm a Chartered Town Planner at Homes England with responsibility for the Compton site. Firstly, I would like to thank your officers for their tireless work to get us to committee this evening. We've worked through many issues together, as outlined in the report, and I'd like to touch on some of those to demonstrate our commitment. I know that design quality is important to officers and the local community, so I want to highlight how we commit to achieving this through the sale and then monitoring of the delivery of development should you grant permission. When we, as Homes England, sell sites to development partners, their bids are scored on their design quality within both their bid and against their reserved matters layout that they propose. And we require them to meet the government's Building for Healthy Life standard, and we will require them to adhere to an external assessment that's already been carried out that demonstrates how much we can achieve out of this site. The reserved matters layout that they propose will also be required to go through external design review with Design Southeast. And then finally, before we allow them to submit a reserved matters application, we as Homes England sign that off before it's submitted to yourselves so that we can ensure that the design quality that we expect as a government's agency pushing design and sustainability quality is met. In relation to future homes, we also place a requirement on bidders to demonstrate how they will meet that in order to demonstrate the sustainability credentials again. And then very briefly, just in terms of future engagement, if permission is granted, we really want to seek to build and maintain a really positive dialogue with the Parish Council. We recognise the challenges over the last year or so, but we want to engage and ensure that they are brought into the design work and also they're updated on the demolition works, because I know that's been a point that's been touched on a number of times tonight. But if I can, I'll pass across to Richard, who will speak further. Thank you.
Many thanks, Mike, and thank you, Chair, for allowing us to speak this evening. I'd just like to highlight a few points, some of which are in reaction and response to the issues raised this evening. As Mike has said, we've developed a scheme for Compton that we believe is fully responsive to the village and links to the delivery of new homes to future employment opportunities. The proposals have been generated in response to an extensive consultation with planning officers, with the local community and with statutory consultees. We've heard from the officer around the details of the scheme, and it's worth noting that 0 statutory objections have been received as the proposals are responsive to various planning documents, including the development plan as a whole and the Compton neighbourhood plan. In that context, I think it's also worth highlighting that the policy requirement is for approximately 140 homes, whereas the application is up for up to 160 homes, an increase of 14%, which is not seen as excessive. Material has also been provided to confirm that the 160 dwellings will not result in harm, and that has, again has been reinforced by the officer. We see that the scheme for the site will result in long-term positive benefits for the village. Clearly, the reuse of brownfield land and the removal of redundant buildings will be important. I think here also worth highlighting that a very detailed site investigation has been undertaken that has informed the scheme itself and has informed the remediation strategy that will be undertaken. So the proposal is—
That's 1 minute, gentlemen, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd also like to reinforce a couple of further points, that the scheme results in a net increase of green infrastructure. The northernmost part of the site will remain undeveloped, and the associated biodiversity net gain increase will be approximately 85.5%. So overall, the scheme is very responsive to Compton as a place. It removes hard boundaries. It improves connections to and within the scheme for existing and local and new residents to enjoy the site. Overall, we believe that it will make a positive contribution to the village longer term.
In conclusion?
Thank you. I have concluded, Chair.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. Members, questions of our gentlemen. I've got Councillor Culver first, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming along this evening. I think there are several positives which you alluded to, including the net gain in biodiversity, so I very much welcome that. However, I think the local community does need some reassurance about the radioactive waste, and you will be fully aware from the documents that have been submitted as part of this publication that you have, or your colleagues have confessed, that there is the issue of not knowing what is underneath the buildings because you can't actually get to them at the moment. A lot of the waste is there from the 1950s before these kind of issues were documented in detail. So I was just wondering what kind of reassurance you can provide to people, because obviously many people who live in that area did actually work on the site and are fully aware of the kind of work that happened there.
Shall I take that, Mike, or do you want to take that?
Feel free to start, Richard. If I need to, I'll come back.
I would emphasise, Councillor, that clearly no development would be beneficial if it didn't deal with any contamination on site. So you're quite right in saying that the site investigation hasn't been undertaken underneath existing buildings, but that is part of the next stage. So clearly removal of all those buildings and therefore the potential contamination, if there is any that will be associated with them, is very much part of the scheme as a whole. And clearly, as Mike has said, Homes England will retain that overarching view of the scheme and retain a view around what the site is and how it will be cleaned up. And clearly, any developer would want reassurance of that as well. So I think there are many, both commercial and practical measures in place to ensure that the site will be cleaned up to a point where it's suitable for residential development.
If I can just add and emphasise that, if I may. As Homes England, as you know, I must admit, I don't necessarily understand whether everybody always realises. I'm sure many of you do, but whether people realise that Homes England is part of government. We are the government's housing accelerator. We are here to strive to deliver affordable housing and to reuse sites such as this. But the key part of that for us on this site is we have taken on the responsibility for the site, and we have taken on the responsibility and have made a commitment to ensure it is cleaned up prior to any redevelopment. That's critical both from our perspective of it's just who we are and what we do, and there are many sites across the country where that has happened, but also it reflects the fact that the wider development industry would expect to see that. Richard has touched on it. The development industry want to see a site from us come to market that is clean, and they wouldn't purchase it off us if it wasn't cleaned up. So in the context of that, yes, obviously, until we can get below ground, it is impossible with absolute certainty to say what is there. However, we do have good records and good knowledge and good investigations to date. But the critical thing is that we also have a very, very competent international renowned consultancies engaged to support us through project management work and detailed assessment work, together with a contractor that we hope to be able to move forward with and appoint if we secure planning, who will be responsible for undertaking that task. And then unless and until they have done that to both our satisfaction and crucially the statutory authorities, principally the Environment Agency, until they are satisfied that we can surrender the environmental permit that we hold on the site, then nothing happens. So it's not a case of just seeking permission and then running on, digging up and go, oh, we found something. I don't say that lightly. You know, we are there to clean up, and we will do the job properly.
Councillor Culver, was that to answer your question? Very comprehensively. Councillor Rolls.
Thank you, Chair. My question's around the community assets. You mentioned about engaging with the local community and working with the local community. And we've just heard, particularly from Compton Parish Council, around objections raised in terms of removal of some of those community assets and replacing, I think, through the gatehouse in terms of sort of offsetting that. Can you just give me a bit more feel for your thinking behind that, and why perhaps you've not been able to meet some of those needs, is my first question. And secondly, just in terms of the cricket ground, I understand from previous comments that it's not currently used and it needs to be resurfaced, etc., or whatever needs to be done. I wonder how that will come together, whether that will be left to the community or how that will be managed, and because also there was talk of having a pavilion to enable that to be used and serviced. So I'd like to hear your comments on that as well, please. Thank you.
No, thank you for the questions. If I can take the cricket ground first, if that's possible. So the screen keeps jumping around, people are moving in front of us. So the cricket ground obviously is identified in local policy as a local green space in the referendum version of the neighbourhood plan. And absolutely, we've respected from the outset that needs to be retained. I think we need to get into the detail of how that is ultimately secured and brought back into use once planning, if planning is granted. But my emerging thinking is that, and I would hope that the parish would be willing to engage in this, is that we have conversations about how we can seek to transfer that site at a minimal cost, potentially, in order to bring it back into use. In terms of the pavilion itself, it is in a very, very poor state of repair, to the point, and forgive me, I wasn't able to be with you on site on Monday. I was on the December visit, but I believe my estates management colleague showed you around, and he may well have pointed out the state of disrepair of that building, which sort of brings me back to your first question. The thinking in our minds was that the gatehouse was a potential asset, a real potential asset for the community. It's quite a modest building, I think, but it's is quite interesting in the sense that it is that arrival point into the site, and it's something that many people will recognise from their potential time employed on the site. So what that use looks like, again, I think we need to get into a sensible conversation, but I can see that being used, as public toilet. Not glamorous, but we all need them occasionally, don't we? Or changing facilities, or parcel drop off, or all sorts of things that we all want to be able to use in our day-to-day lives. So again, not necessarily giving you the detail of the answer, forgive me, but hopefully showing that we want to open a conversation. In terms of the existing, or the previous rather, facilities that were on site, as has been touched on in response to others, those facilities closed at the point at which the Institute closed and have not been available for a number of years. I recognise that they performed a very important role in the community at that time. However, they are no longer operational. We've had no formal approach about bringing those back into use. And I think more widely, in terms of the hostel site, which has an interrelationship with the nursery, they are sites that would make it very difficult to hit the policy requirement about comprehensive redevelopment, because you would end up in a potential scenario where you've got very high quality new development across the bulk of the site and something that's very much of its time in a relatively small pocket. So hopefully that answers the question. But I mean, the commitment is absolutely there to work with the community to see how we can potentially bring the gatehouse into use alongside the cricket pitch.
Sorry, Chairman, just it's interesting that you're replacing quite substantial amounts of building with a gatehouse, I guess. Is that right? It's basically they're getting less community space based on the proposals from what there is at the moment, or was formerly.
Well, I think that final point that you just made there is key there formally, because at the moment, in simple terms, there are no community facilities available within this site. It's a 24-hour secured site with no public access. Previous, absolutely, okay. Absolutely, yes. But what we were looking to try and do is to recognise, yes, there was that, and there isn't now, and the likelihood of an operator wanting to use that certainly hasn't come forward to us. So the gatehouse was an opportunity to do something.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rolls. I'll take Chairman's privilege here, Mr. Harris, and really leading on from Councillor Rolls' question. It's an aspiration of stated within the Neighbourhood Development Plan of retention of a number of the buildings. Are you here to tell me then that the hostel itself is not viable with this wider project?
Correct, Chairman. Essentially, the hostel buildings aren't really suitable for modern living. They're not designed as individual properties. As yourselves, you walked around the site on Monday. They were fit for purpose for how they were used, but their condition and the requirement to bring them up to current sort of standard, and also the aspiration for net zero that's been spoken about today, it's just not feasible and not viable.
Thank you very, very much for that. I've got Councillor Vickers next, please.
Thank you. I think my question has probably been answered. It was also about the hostel. Having visited the site, that's an interesting building, particularly the central one. And I was disappointed to hear that what was a relatively new building, I know it would probably need a lot of modification, couldn't be used and retained. I would have thought it would add interest to the site, as well as from the point of view of reducing energy costs and all these issues around climate change that we're concerned about. It would mean, less new materials used. Is it just about the cost of converting the inside, the convenience? Could it not be modified, at least for some community use, as well as some small dwellings, as has been suggested by the parish council? But you possibly answered it, but that was going to be my point anyway. I'm just disappointed to hear it can't be used.
Thank you, Councillor Vickers. Do you want to pick up anything there, Mr. Harris? cost and
I think I largely answered it, but I don't know whether Richard wants to pick up and say anything further.
I would actually, because clearly the officer kindly presented the illustrative layout for the scheme, and we did a lot of work with officers and landscape officers to come up with a scheme that fulfilled the requirements of the overall proposition, as it were, and the overall concept. And that certainly didn't allow for the integration of the hostel, because it simply doesn't work. It doesn't follow the principles of what we want to achieve in terms of that open and outlooking development. So together with the cost and the viability issues that Mike has raised, there's also layout and its relationship to the wider village as well, which had to be taken into account.
Thank you very much indeed. Councillor Wollaston next, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm just intrigued to know why, when the local development plan is saying 140 units, you've chosen to go for 160, because clearly it's making your life rather more difficult. Is it a viability matter?
Sorry, I shouldn't laugh, but it in a sense it is making our life harder in a way. But no, it's not a viability matter, as I said earlier, in relation to the contamination. We're fully committed, and we bear that cost. In terms of why 160 and prior to that why 185, and I hesitate because I recognise that we've been doing this for a while, and we have understandably caused some angst amongst the community, and for that we would apologise. But I think the why 185 and now why 160 in front of you now is in simple terms. We feel that the site can accommodate that. You know, in master planning terms, in landscape impact terms, we believed, certainly at 185, and we absolutely believe at 160 that the site is capable of delivering that number of homes. And crucially, you know, we have a government policy, but both planning policy and the National Planning Policy Framework, and our recent new Secretary of State, who is very, very committed to the reuse of brownfield land. So as the government's agency seeking to deliver housing, you know, that's first and foremost what I'm here to do, is to deliver housing, and critically affordable housing. My view is that whilst 160 is an uplift over 140, albeit the policy says approximately, that's a good thing, because it means we're sensitively using a site, we're making best use of previously developed land, and I can provide a little bit more affordable housing. And I think that's critical in an area such as this.
Well done. Okay, thank you very much. I've got Councillor Camp next, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mike, I want to link this back to an issue raised by an objector to the scheme. I guess it was fairly subjective. An objector is a recent arrival at the location into a new build who had apparently experienced some difficulties with flooding, including foul water flooding over a period of several years. And I wanted to link that in with the commitment in 5102 of the application relating to Thames Water and their role in constructing the infrastructure that will deal with this side. And I'm trying to get my head around how you're going to approach, I don't know if you recall that paragraph, it says that the foul water infrastructure is only able to deal with an additional 20 dwellings, and the water supply with only 50 dwellings of your 160. I do fully understand that, Homes England operate between can I call it, a much more ethical framework than developer would normally, as you're not profit motivated. But I just want to know, my concern, I guess, would be how you address that issue of the potential for exacerbating flooding problems during the course of construction, particularly for existing residents, and whether I've dealt myself with having infrastructure installed by utility companies, and I know that you're one on a very long list of jobs nationally, and sometimes it can take considerable amounts of time to complete. And I'm concerned about how you're going to deal with that whole issue around, are you going to part build? Are you going to complete the site? Are all the footings for the 160 going in first? I'm concerned about the impact on the local community of a very protracted development, delayed by infrastructure development.
Thank you, Councillor Cant.
Thank you. I think I got all of that. So apologies, my connection was breaking up slightly. I'll say a few words and I might pass to Richard and or Jim. I think the critical thing is that whilst the gentleman earlier was touching on his experiences, and clearly very unpleasant experiences. The key thing is that the Thames Water consultation response doesn't object, subject to imposition of a condition requiring the infrastructure improvements to be put in place. And I think, in simple terms, until we and or a developer is able to meet and discharge that condition, then development, forgive me, I haven't read the exact wording of the condition in front of me right now, but it, we would have to adhere to that condition first. Jim, Richard, I don't know whether you have any detailed comments from colleagues, or
I think it'd be worth, I mean, in terms of your comment, Mike, I think it's very pertinent, because clearly Thames cannot really assess a detailed scheme, because at the moment we have not put a detailed layout in front of them. So it is very normal for them to put, for there to be a condition in place that will be developed through a reserved matters process. So I think it's a normal process. It's right to be that they have concerns, because that they understand the context, but the reserved matters and the condition is there to deal with that, and the detail will be resolved through the firstly through the construction management plan, and then through the contractor, who will have to resolve and respond to the reserved matters issues.
Sorry, Chair, just simple clarity for me is, so what you're saying is infrastructure will go in first and development will then start, not there's going to be some hybrid development stroke infrastructure program running side by side.
Oh, sorry, Councillor, I don't know the detail on that, but it will be formed part of, I'm sure, a lot of debate and discussion in terms of how that detail is resolved. And certainly I think officers will be very keen to understand that from the outset, rather than it being less detail within that conditions solution, as it were.
I think, if I may, I think that's probably a question Councillor Kent might like to direct towards officers when we get to that point. Thank you very much. Councillor Barnett, please.
Through you, Chairman, Mr. Harris, quite a bit of discussion has taken place about contaminants, whether it's known or not known, or what the contaminants might well be. And there's also a plan, obviously, in relationship to demolition, as well as the decontamination of the site. Do you think 18 months is a little bit conservative? You made it quite clear that the object was to make sure it is totally cleared of any contaminants before any construction takes place. What would you say in relationship to the 18 months? Is it in tablets of stone, or is it just a figure that you would hope to work to?
I think that's a really good question. So since December last year, we as I alluded to earlier, we've engaged Arcadis. Some of you at the Parish Council certainly will have met some of them when I gave a briefing a couple of months ago. Arcadis have worked up very, very detailed specification for the demolition and remediation programme. And their initial understanding, or their initial view based on their professional judgment, was that it was around 18 to 24 months of programme. We've recently undertaken a procurement exercise, which is very close to concluding, and we went out to the marketplace, and very large, very experienced contractors came back and gave us their view on what the likely programme would be. So when we cite 18 months, that is their probably more conservative estimate, if I'm honest. Some parties suggested it would be a lot quicker, which understandably would be better in terms of reducing the period of time for potential impacts from that programme of works. However, I think we would all agree that the right thing to do is to get it right, and to get it right and do it properly and do it once. So the estimate is it's around 18 months, and I'm not going to say in front of you here and now that yes, it will be 18 months, but that is the hope. That's the expectation.
Thank you very much. And finally, I've got Councillor Cole.
Thank you, Chairman. Can we go back to the subject of the hostel, please? Having gone round the site, sadly, we weren't allowed into the buildings like the hostel, which was perhaps a pity. But that was the only building that has, and I mean the central hostel building, that as heritage champion of West Berks, I saw as future heritage. And I would be unhappy to see that torn down for that reason. When you add the fact that in terms of climate change, if we don't have to destroy buildings and rebuild them, perhaps there's good reason to retain. Now, are you telling us that that one should go simply because somebody had the idea that the whole thing should be redeveloped, or that it's sitting over contamination, or what?
Richard, can I ask you to
Well, Councillor, yes, it's a number of aspects, I think, and it's not just about one issue. We've talked about contamination, and yes, there will be an issue regarding the ground floor slab and removal of that to make sure that the site is fully cleaned up. As we've said, we've talked about layout as a whole. We've talked about the way in which the site responds to the wider context. We talked about viability and the way in which a comprehensive development should take place. And it's all these things coming together that have really made us come to the conclusion that, unfortunately, in this situation, that the hostel cannot be retained. So it's similar to other buildings on site, frankly. There was a very detailed site assessment undertaken early in the scheme, which did look at retention as a potential solution. But that came back with the conclusion, really, that we needed to fully remediate and we needed to fully develop the site in order to bring it to a point where that comprehensive development could take place.
Interesting. Different question. There's been some reference during this evening's conversation to long-term maintenance of things like the green areas. Has thought been given to how this will be handled? You're putting in large numbers of trees. Trees, sadly, need maintenance to ensure that they do grow as they're meant to grow. What will you be planning to do about this?
I think ultimately that's a matter for the Reserve Matters application and for how ultimately what finally comes
Detail
forward.
will be, of course.
Yeah, the detail of the layout and the landscape and all of those points, and I would expect your officers to seek to secure that kind of maintenance, that management regime and management plan through that process. But I would go back to what I said earlier, which is that we place, and I place, a huge importance on design and stewardship and the long-term kind of creation of place. It's really key to how my thinking as a planning professional. So I go back to what I said earlier, which is that if a Reserve Matters layout comes in front of us from a developer that we're not satisfied with, we wouldn't be prepared to sign it off for submission. So you've got that added layer of protection. So that's quite a neat practical example. Hopefully that answers.
Answer that, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Councillor Moore came in and disappeared. You're done? Okay. Members, I think, unless I'm mistaken, we're done asking questions. Yes, we are. Thank you very much. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time this evening and fielding the questions.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Karimi, if you'd escort them back to the virtual waiting room. We then come on to the ward member, Karen Culver. If you'd address the committee from your seat. I shan't insult you by telling you how it works. I'll start the clock when you begin.
Okay, thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman and members. There were around 330 objections to this planning application, including from local villages. We need to appreciate the significance of this application. The village currently has 624 homes, and this is an addition of 160, so that represents a 25% increase in the size of this village. I do welcome the positive things that have been mentioned this evening, so the retention of the cricket pitch, the green zone at the top of the site, the employment zone, and so on. But I would like to particularly emphasise one thing, and that is the housing mix on the site and the hostel, which other members have mentioned. The NDP does recommend the retention of the hostel, but this planning application this evening proposes demolition. We do need more 1 and 2 bedroom houses, and I believe that the restoration of this hostel would allow us to achieve that. The application does not meet the need for 1-bed homes outlined in the Strategic Housing Market Assessment of 2016 or in the Council's Housing Strategy of 2020 to 2036. The Strategic Housing Market Assessment identifies that 48% of affordable homes in West Berkshire should be 1 bed. On a brownfield site like this with 30% affordable housing, that would mean 23 affordable 1-bed homes. There are no 1-bed homes proposed in this application. Homes England representatives have mentioned just now that one of their objectives is to provide more affordable housing on behalf of the government, but they're clearly not meeting what we have outlined in our own plans and strategies. According to the same housing assessment, 9% of market homes should be 1 bed. This would equate to 10 market 1-bed homes on the site. There are none. According to our housing strategy, only 20 to 25% of all market homes and 5 to 10% of affordable homes need to be 4-bed or above, but this application has 35%. That's nearly twice as much. Policy CS4, which documentation tonight says that this application meets, I would argue that this application does not meet policy. And as our former member Hilary Cole often said, we are a policy-led authority. And I would strongly argue that this does not meet policy CS4. It doesn't meet the housing needs assessment and it doesn't meet the housing strategy. We know during COVID that we need to have extended families staying in the same area together, and Compton is very strongly that kind of village. We need to alleviate the pressure on the amount of money we spend as a local authority on adult social care. We don't have enough carers. We need young adults to be able to stay in their local area and to afford a home. We need older residents to be able to downsize. This is why we need more smaller homes on this site. We need to keep those communities together. We don't want this application to basically create a commuter suburb in Compton. We need to keep the local community together for the long term so that it's resilient. In terms of demolition, it's clearly preferable to build on a brownfield site rather than the greenfield site, which is to be welcomed, but it is an 18-month demolition programme. It's a very long time. Approximately 100 vehicles are going to be going through Compton and potentially East Ilsley each day before the construction even begins. As we already know from people who've spoken tonight, there is a tight blind bend pinch point within East Ilsley. Vehicles, buses, school vehicles, for example, is a big problem. I would argue we should at least have a condition to say that the demolition and construction vehicles should not be moving during school hours. And if they have to head north towards Oxfordshire, they're going to have to negotiate a very tight area in the village where houses literally abut the road. There is no pavement and there are no gardens to protect them. And in terms of contamination, residents are extremely concerned. I have read the documentation in great detail. It does say, thank you, Chairman. It does say that they don't know what's under the building. My understanding from a former vet is that there is radioactive material from Bikini Atoll on the site, and they do not know where it is. They can't find it. We've got these kind of problems to contend with. And we know from COVID that we need to avoid cross-contamination between humans and animals. So this is a prime example of the kind of thing that we should be very, very careful about. The Environment Agency also has concerns about pollution of groundwater, and I think our conditions need to be strengthened in regard to that as well. So that concludes my comments, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Culver. Members, questions of the ward member, please. Looking around, there are no hands. Councillor Culver, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, members, we now come on to questions of clarification from the officers. Who will start me off, please, with members of clarification? I've got Councillor Moore first, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know which officer that this is particularly aimed at, but I'm just fascinated by the word approximately in terms of the allocation. So we've got approximately 140, and that's causing the issues with the proposal at 160. When the word approximately is used in officers' minds, what does that mean? Plus or minus 10%? You know, could somebody unpack that for me?
Mrs. Mather, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, I can pick that one up. So it's essentially through the planning policy work, when the site was allocated, the housing number was identified primarily due to landscape considerations and AONB considerations. It did not give a maximum. It gave an approximate. It doesn't give guidance on whether that's plus or minus 10%. I think it was to allow for proposals to come forward that then could be assessed in terms of their impact on the character of the village and the AONB. The application, as you can see, started off at 250 and included housing in Area A to the north. And in consultation with our landscape consultant, we reached the point where they felt, and they indicated of their own accord, that they felt that 160 could be accommodated within the site, given the size of the site, within the parameters. As you can see, the allocation gave a developable area in which the housing could go. The developable area in the parameters plan is actually slightly less than that. So there are quite considerable landscape buffers and limits on heights and conditions. So ultimately, the number has been accepted from a planning point of view in terms of the impacts. And then that is also alongside the highways impacts that Paul mentioned earlier, are also considered acceptable for 160. So yeah, the approximate doesn't set a maximum. In terms of the reference from Compton Parish Council, their policy C2 states that the housing number should remain approximately 140, and that any additional development beyond that should be justified. And the justification it sets out is in terms of landscape, scenic beauty, impacts on the AONB.
Thank you, Mrs. Mather. I've got Councillor Rolls next, please.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of questions. Firstly, officers mentioned the Compton Neighbourhood Development Plan in terms of the timing of that effectively coming into effect in February. I'm just wondering on the timing of this committee meeting, why we're hearing this application now without giving that the opportunity to actually go through the consultation piece is my first question, because obviously that does have more of a bearing from what officers have said in terms of this development and the influence of that. And my second question is to Highways, Mr. Goddard. I just wondered why we're relying on a transport assessment that was done, I believe, in June 2017, quite a few years ago. Was my first question, why that's not more up to date, because that's 4 years ago. And also, we've heard a lot about the impact through the villages, East Ilsley and Compton, the schools, etc. I just wondered where that fits within the overall assessment from Highways, which seems to be based more per dwelling and on the whole development rather than the actual more impact on the local community. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rolls. As we'll pick up at Highways first, Mr. Goddard, please, if you tackle those two.
I can, thank you. The first point was that, yes, they did extensive survey at all junctions covering as far as Aldworth, Hampstead, Norreys and East Ilsley. And yes, the traffic surveys all took place in June 17. My response with that would be, well, good. because over the last 2 years, due to our friend COVID, we've just not accepted any up-to-date surveys because we just don't think that we can get a representative sample because traffic levels on the network have ebbed and flowed along with COVID-19 ebbing and flowing. And I don't think it's going to be until COVID-19 sort of subsides, and we all hope that eventually it will. It's not going to be till then until we get some idea on what the traffic patterns on the network are going to be. So my advice to you is that actually, yes, that the survey data is 4.5 years old, but I think it's the best that we have at the moment, and it's probably higher volumes than what we're probably going to get now or going forward in the future. But with regards to, I mentioned all the areas that were assessed, where the junctions were assessed, and I think what Councillor Rolls mentioned there was school time, and I think that's perhaps highlighting the concern about construction traffic. There will be construction traffic, and it's mentioned in your report on page 48. But you do have within your packs condition 19 that details the construction management plan, and we can dictate the haul routes. We can dictate the time of deliveries to avoid school times, and if there are pinch points in places like East Eilsley, then we would expect within that construction management plan, or when it's submitted, how the developer, how the contractor is going to mitigate any harm at said pinch points and ensure that any impact is reduced as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goddard. And I think, Councillor Rose, your question regarding the neighbourhood development plan. Mr. Till, do you want to pick that one up?
I think I'll let Mrs. Mather have a response to it first of all, as she's made a detailed assessment of the policies of the neighbourhood development plan and also the timing of it.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Mather.
Thank you. So the Compton Neighbourhood Development Plan, when the application was first submitted, so the initial statutory target date for this application was September last year. At that point in time, and until relatively recently, the Compton Neighbourhood Development Plan carried limited weight because it's been progressing alongside the application. And you will have attended, or presumably attended, the council meeting at the end of last year, where it was agreed that the neighbourhood development plan could go to referendum, and that is at the point at which it carries considerable weight. So officers have been assessing the scheme against it, but obviously the weight has changed as the application has gone along, and you can't sort of assume at any stage that it will definitely be found sound, that it will definitely go to referendum. And then at this point, I would hope for the local community that it is adopted, but obviously it still needs to pass the referendum, and that's not happened yet. It might seem that the application is now in front of you close to the referendum date, but as you'll be aware from the previous Western Area Planning meeting, this item was scheduled a month ago to be in front of you, but unfortunately there was not enough time to consider it. So it's come before you when the application has been ready, and officers feel that it's at a point that we can put it in front of you for determination. And we've fully taken into account the neighbourhood development plan in terms of where it is now and the weight that it carries. And we've tried to make a full and reasonable assessment against those policies. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I've got Councillor Culver next, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Just a couple of points from me. Regarding the employment area, it doesn't seem to be in the conditions. So if we could address that, that would be useful. And if Mr. Till or Ms. Mather could comment on, is it the case that that would be protected in perpetuity until such time as an application came forward asking for a change of use. And my second question is regarding the zero carbon condition, which we added in the update paper for the previous meeting. Mr. Till, could you elaborate a bit on how this carbon zero thing is to be achieved? Because in the terms of conditions for the section 106, it says that there will be a 19% improval on the building regulations part L. So is it going to be a 19% increase on figure X, or is it going to be a completely carbon zero site? If you could give us a bit more detail, I'd be grateful. Thank you.
Right, so shall I
respond on the part of that question that's addressed to me first of all?
If you would, please.
Thank you, Chairman. The requirement in terms of the conditions is for delivery of zero carbon energy source site in line with policy CS15. The terms of the legal agreement are a separate thing, but in order to comply with the conditions of a planning permission that was granted for this, it would need to meet the requirements of CS15 rather than anything set out in the legal agreement. The requirements of the conditions would effectively supersede that aspect of the legal agreement. And in terms of delivery of it, well, this is a outline planning permission in respect of the actual developed area itself that is being sought. So my answer to you would have to be that those details would need to come forward with a strategy appropriately in discharge of the condition requiring compliance with policy CS15, apologies, and also that details in terms of design and layout, which might crucially affect the ability of the development to comply, are reserved matters in this particular case. So there's more information needed at a later stage right now, but we have there the requirement in terms of the conditions that we've requested.
Thank you very much, Mr. Till. Mrs. Mather, if you can tackle the question about the employment area.
Yeah. So the proposed employment area would be effectively change of use of land, but it doesn't have development on it. So it's controlled by the permission in terms of commencement of change of use. It's included in terms of the demolition and removal of hard standing so that it's ready to be developed. There are phasing plans, reserve matters and so on that would need to be applied for different parts of the site. So yes, it would be controlled. And yes, it would need change of use if a planning application, if a proposal came forward for an alternative use.
Thank you very much indeed. Councillor Cole next, please.
Hey, Chairman. The documentation refers to district heating and makes a very blunt refusal to consider the idea of district heating as I get it. This sort of site, on the face of it, looks as if it might be ideal for district heating. And the ability to do district heating is certainly improving. Now, I realize we're a couple of years away from any detail on this. This can wait until the reserve matters. Are we able to condition that this be at least reconsidered?
Mrs. Mather.
Okay. Yes, you're correct that reserve matters in terms of layout and so on, and in terms of discharging the zero carbon condition, that a district heating could be part of that. It would depend on how it would be provided as to whether it might need permission in its own right. The view that we've taken is that the condition for zero carbon could effectively include measures that I guess they wouldn't fully achieve the same thing, but the principle of more sustainable heating and electricity generation on site can be dealt with by that condition. Yes, if you wish to apply an additional condition for district heating to be submitted at reserve matters, I'm looking to Simon because I'm concerned that there might be additional development that might then need permission in its own right. I don't know if he's got any views on that. Sorry, if you don't mind us discussing amongst officers.
Additional heating. I was only asking for it to be reconsidered.
Yeah.
No more than that.
Okay.
Mr. Till, is that something that could be revisited?
I think it would be a case, and bearing in mind that we're not in debate and not discussing resolutions at this point, but it could certainly be something to be included in an informative for exploration through a statement to be submitted with reserve matters.
Thank you, Mr. Till. Councillor Cole, does that satisfy you?
That satisfies me on that one, absolutely. May I ask one more? On the neighbourhood development plan, Councillor Rolls was satisfied with the reply she had. May I ask a question slightly more bluntly? If the neighbourhood plan had gone through a referendum, would we have refused this application on the basis of it being 160 instead of 140?
I wouldn't. Officers wouldn't be recommending refusal if it carried full weight. It carries considerable weight, so not much less than full weight in its current form. The parish council obviously would disagree with officers on that point, but the neighbourhood development plan policy also talks about approximately 140, and for any additional to be demonstrated through landscape impact assessments and assessments in order to be considered acceptable. Their opinion is that that's not been justified, but officers are of the view that we have considered those matters and we consider it acceptable. So in short, the recommendation would remain the same if those policies carried full weight from officers' point of view.
Thank you. There are clear implications as far as other neighbourhood plans are concerned, but thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much indeed. I've got Councillor Barnett next.
Right, Chairman. Question for Mr. Goddard. I know we've already had some discussions about the traffic movements and particular the access through very narrow streets in leading out and in East Ilsley, and I know particularly a double-decker Weaver Wave buses between 8 and 9, and obviously 3 and 4. Building construction vehicles and building supplies normally, of course, are required early in the morning. If there is any restriction placed on accessing the site, bearing in mind, of course, most of the site construction operations start at 7:30, what would you be recommending in relationship to the times that the vehicles are allowed to actually come into the village? I.e. Compton, in this case, leading from the A34 at East Ilsley.
Mr. Goddard?
Well, firstly, what I would do is ascertain when the schools open and close, both schools, and avoid HGV movements half an hour both sides of that. It is quite standard practice when we have developments that are relatively close to schools, and this, of course, is no exception. So we would use the condition 19 that I mentioned earlier, and when they submitted a construction management plan, part of that plan would include restricting any large vehicles travelling to Compton during those times before and after the schools open and when they close.
Okay. Thank you very much. I've got a couple more hands to tackle. I'll come to the chairman first, though, if I may, please. A couple of things I'd like to clarify, please, Mrs. Mather. Contamination of the site. How content are we that the clear up is in hand? We've had concerns expressed. Can you go into that in a little more detail, please?
Yes. So the conditions that are recommended on land contamination are based on the conditions that have been provided to us from the Environment Agency and Environmental Health as specialists in considering those matters. There has been a site investigation submitted. It has been fully considered by those officers and planning officers. We are content that whilst the wording might be similar to other situations, it still covers those eventualities. It's still detailed. It still requires information ahead of each phase if the development were to be phased. We feel it captures all that it needs to, regardless of the extent and seriousness, I suppose, of the contamination.
Thank you very much. And I'll steal Councillor Cant's thunder here regarding the waste management and potential future degradation of the facility over time. How will that be managed? Who's going to be taking control of that?
The SUDS, the non-infiltration of the flooding mitigation.
Yes.
Yes. So again, in the conditions and in the planning obligation, things like the open space, which would include the cricket ground, and the landscape management and the management of SUDS features are all, the management of them is within conditions and within the planning obligation to allow for transfer to management companies or transfer to us or to the parish council. So there are triggers in there for the land transfer and the management of those features.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Mather. I move now to Councillor Rolls.
Thank you, Chairman. You stole my question on the SUD, so thank you for answering that, Mrs. Mather. But also, I had another question, which was just going back to Councillor Culver's comments regarding the one bed requirement under our policies, and I just wondered what your comments were on that. And actually, before you answer, just the point Councillor Cole made about I was satisfied with the answer on the neighbourhood plan. I was satisfied that you answered it. I'm not necessarily satisfied with the approach, which I'll bring up in debate. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, that's understood. Thank you. On the housing mix is a reserved matter as part of the layout. So what was presented was indicative based on the illustrative master plan. And yes, you're correct. It shows 25% 2-bed and 75% 3 to 5 bed. I think in the report, it talks about the fact that it doesn't fully comply with the strategic housing management assessment, but obviously we would be looking to an alteration for that at reserved matters. The point of the illustrative layout is to show that you can get a housing mix and that number of houses within the parameter plans. There is also limits on heights to ensure that there would be some bungalows, some single-storey dwellings provided. So we feel that the mix can be achieved, but it is something that at reserved matters.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I had Councillor Moore next, but you're out, Councillor Moore.
Yeah, Councillor Rolls achieved my question, so congratulations to her. But I just wanted to follow that slightly to say to ask the question whether if one came down from 3 4-bedroom homes to 1-bedroom homes, it moving up from 140 to 160 would be slightly less controversial. Does anybody want to comment on that? Would the officers comment on that?
Mr. Mather?
Yes, so again, it will come down to reserve matters because, as you say, these things all interact with each other. So layout and scale and housing mix will all alter how the development will work on site, but it will still need to comply with policies. It will still need to go through a similar process in terms of impacts on landscape and so on. So yes, if you remove some 3-bed to 1-bed, then as you say, that goes in a beneficial direction in terms of unit size.
Thank you very much. And finally, I've got Councillor Culver.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a very quick question of Mr. Goddard. Would it be acceptable to condition a pedestrian crossing on the high street, bearing in mind the increased number of people that will be trying to cross the road?
There are, as part of the Section 106 terms, there are some pedestrian improvements that will be requested and provided. The details have yet to be determined at this stage, but there will be some. Whether it's a signalised pedestrian crossing, I don't know. There are certain criteria that my colleagues in traffic management would tell me, number of vehicle flows and traffic flows that would be required until it required to be a signalised crossing. But it is something that could be looked at, and I think the terms of the Section 106 do allow that to happen. It might not be quite the full answer you're looking for, but I think it's probably the best that I can provide at the moment, because we haven't really yet worked out these details.
Thank you, Mr. Goddard. Members, are we done with questions of our officers? I'll now move this on to debate. Who'd like to start me off, please? Thank you, Councillor Culver.
I thought I'd try and let someone else go first, but
we don't have Councillor Abbs here this evening, so
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I think we've had a really good discussion tonight. Lots of points have been raised. I would emphasise the fact that I don't think that this application meets policy CS4, and for that reason, I don't support this application. I think we could refurbish the hostel. It would be more carbon friendly to refurbish rather than to knock something down and rebuild it. As Councillor Moore mentioned, there's a certain irony that if we were to have more one-bed houses in that hostel, that would help to increase the number of homes on the site, and then the issue of how many homes there are would not be such a problem. I personally gained a foothold on the housing ladder because I was able to buy a one-bed flat initially, and then it was the increase in the value of that flat that enabled me to buy something bigger. And I think unless we have the one-bed properties which we ourselves say that we should have in our housing assessment and our housing strategy, those young people that have grown up in that area have nowhere that they can afford to buy, and they move somewhere else, and it breaks the community apart. So I really, really emphasise the fact that we should be, if these policies are going to mean anything, we should seriously look at the one-bed house issue. Also, the pickled pig and the Piglets Day Nursery, one of the representatives from Homes England tonight talked about the fact that no one had been in there for a while and seemed to dismiss it on those grounds. The fact no one's been in there is because they've not been allowed to go in there. There is still a need for those community assets. And I think to say that the gatehouse would be given as a community asset is not a like for like. As members saw when we were there the other day, it's a very small building. It's not fit for purpose, and it's right next to the only entry and exit point for that site. So if you were to use that for childcare, for example, you would have a constant stream of vehicles coming in and out right past that building. How can that be safe? We should be conditioning, and the applicant should be respectful of the NDP when it comes to things like the nursery facilities that we've lost. And with regard to the contamination report, it is really, really worrying. I don't know if members have had an opportunity to read everything. There is a lot of paperwork associated with this. But I'll just quote from one. It said, the one sample taken from the animal remains from the sheep pen, which in situ testing identified containing above background levels of radiation, was sent for laboratory testing, which determined the material is above the out of scope waste limits. It is recommended that this material sorted on site with the presence of a radiological protection supervisor and is disposed of off site and is buried at depth. So this is the kind of stuff that we're talking about. It's stuff that's come from Bikini Atoll. You know, it's big. It's a really, really big issue. And I would argue that this kind of issue should have been dealt with before we even thought about whether this was an appropriate place to build homes. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Culver. I've got Councillor Camp next, please.
Thank you, Chair. Very interesting debate. First of all, I was very impressed by the depth into which the officers have gone in preparing a very complex report on the site. And also, I was very sensitive to the impact this will have on the local community for a considerable time while the construction is underway. However, in a sort of counter to Councillor Culver's observations, I've had quite a bit to do in the past with Homes England. I know their ethos is not one, obviously, to profit maximise. And although I'm sure they have their faults, I have seen them being extremely thorough. Maybe even in some cases overcautious to ensure that brownfield sites are thoroughly cleansed before construction commences. So I'm much reassured by the observations of our colleagues from Homes England, and personally I'll be supporting this application, I think.
Councillor Barnett, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Again, I think, yeah, as what's already been said by Councillor Culver, a thorough question sessions we've had of the various interested parties, and it's very valuable to actually have the opportunity to question these various groups. Whilst obviously welcoming the use of a redundant site, I'm obviously saddened to see what I felt was some very substantial and well-built buildings, not too old, I might add, and I would have expected that some of those buildings could have been put to some other use. And we've obviously had a discussion tonight about the hostel in particular, but there was a few other buildings that I took note of as well. But having said that, of course, one has to accept it's probably in the area where we need to consider the application in depth. The great concern I've got, and it wasn't until it was mentioned by one of the parish representatives, this issue of radioactive materials. There's sealed sources which were probably used to irradiate animals, I suspect, or there could have been equipment that was contaminated through a source of radioactive material. And that could well be, perhaps, we don't know, even animals. And that's probably the big concern I would have, is where any radioactive waste of any kind, whether it's animal material or even other material that's been contaminated, and that has been sealed underground or put in some storage area that's unknown to the individuals considering looking at the site. What that would involve in relation to seepage, obviously the water courses and seepage underground across the whole of the site. It might not be in an isolated area, it could well be in a large area. And that's one of the reasons why I question that issue of the 18 months for the decontamination of the site. I have great concerns that that won't happen if even the application is passed. I think it would go on for a long period of time, and the poor residents of Compton will have to put up with a very long period of construction or decontamination operations, as well as the demolition operations, which of course could create a lot of mess as well, and disturbance and vehicles. And furthermore, the site in particular, 160 units, it might well substantiate a little bit more of a village community, but nevertheless, the village community, will it be able to sustain the existing the school? Will it be able to take on board the extra generated school students? Will a doctor's surgery be able to accommodate the extra houses and residents? And furthermore, the existing retail units. I mean, there's only a couple of small units in the village itself. Would that be sustainable? No, I suspect what would happen is there'd be more vehicles in and out of other areas or travelling around when we're trying to hope that people will take less journeys. So overall, I have a little concern about this particular application. I feel it's an application where we should be considering regenerating that particular site, but I think it's being done in the wrong way, and I would be supporting Councillor Culver in objecting to that present application.
Councillor Barnett. I will Councillor Rolls next.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll try and keep this relatively brief. First of all, commend officers for the extensive report, which was incredibly helpful, and for all their work on this over a considerable period of time. I think from my perspective, and I think most members and indeed the parish councils seem to accept that this site does need tidying up. There needs to be something done with it. But I have a few concerns, one of which I share with Councillor Barnett around the length of the clean-up because of the nature of what this site was used for previously and the impact that that will have on the local community over a potentially long period of time, albeit with these things, no doubt you have to put an estimate on it and move forward on that. I am disappointed that the community seemed to lose significant assets, which I think we all appreciated, or very certainly, several of us have commented on the actual demolition of perfectly good buildings, and the Heritage Champion has commented on that. I feel certainly in my own ward where we have had new development taking place that actually these community assets would be invaluable to integrate new residents into the local community, and therefore it's disappointing to see that there's significant loss of that and replacement by a fairly limited building, which to my mind does not replace the extent and the value of the current community assets. And that seemed to be one of the major objections lodged, which I share concern with. And also I do have concerns that Compton have gone to great lengths to develop their neighbourhood development plan. It went to full council. We commended it at length. We discussed it at full council. And it is really, a lot of work goes into these plans. And I think that this application shouldn't have been heard before that had had a chance to reach fruition or not, bearing in mind we are January and we're talking about February for that to close. And in terms of the overall timescale of this development, we're talking a long period of time for this development. If it is granted planning permission to take place, I don't think a month would have made much difference. So I'm very, very disappointed that we're fairly, to my mind, look dismissive of a neighbourhood plan which is going through the process, and I don't agree with officers in terms of their approach on that. And I'm going to just see how the debate unfolds before I make my decision. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Rolls. Councillor Culver.
It's very difficult, this, as far as I'm concerned. We have, on the one hand, clearly some horrendous contamination that needs to be removed. The village will benefit by the removal in the long term of that contamination. I heard the reaction that there haven't been problems of the kids getting in there, but it will happen if it hasn't already. And so the sooner the job is done, the better. But I'm not happy that the best is being made of this, in this application. I think a little lateral thinking about how to use that perfectly good existing building, which doesn't need knocking down. They're not actually claiming that it needs knocking down. It's just convenient as part of the overall picture. Actually, that's a rather nice building overlooking the cricket ground. And it could be retained, and it could be turned into maybe a community asset, some one-bedroom flats, as Councillor Culver has observed. I find this rather difficult. Thank you, Chairman.
Considering that, Councillor Culver. Councillor Williston.
Thank you, Chairman. I think we have to bear in mind this is an outline application only. It's not a detailed application. And we have a very responsible applicant who's government-backed. They're not cowboys by remotely. The existing buildings, to my view, are an absolute eyesore. Something's got to be done with them. And that's going to involve demolition, inevitably, it's going to involve inevitably amelioration of the ground and so forth. We could, I think, have an informative on the possible consent, looking at more one-bedroom properties and indeed additional community use. But to my mind, this is something we should consent to, and as such, I'd like to propose that we accept officer's recommendation.
That's noted, Councillor Wilson. I'll go around the hands.
Sorry, before you do, can I just check about conditions so we're very clear on what the proposal is? Is it conditions as per the officer's recommendation? Sorry, can you not hear me?
Yes, as of the officer's recommendations and with some additional informatives.
Okay, because I think if you're going to make a proposal, can we have them set out? And then before we have a seconder, we'll go to Councillor Moore, just so we're clear what the proposal is.
I'm sorry, when I said following officer's recommendations, I assumed that included the conditions.
I just wanted, there's been a bit of talk about conditions and about also the heads of terms of the section 106. So I just wanted to check at this stage, that's definitely what your proposal was. In terms of the heads of terms for the section 106, there was a discussion about a conflict between the zero carbon condition and the heads of term. Did you want the section 106 to reflect the zero carbon condition?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Mrs. Arnold, you're happy with?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Councillor Wilson. I'll go to Councillor Moore next, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Like others, I'm struggling a bit with this. It feels to me that there's a timeline here, and at some point, this site will need to be remediated and cleared and developed. The question, I think, is whether the proposal that we have in front of us this evening is just at the sweet point in terms of its development and timing. And I think particularly given the situation with the Compton development plan, my feeling is we're just slightly too early, and we should probably come back to it shortly, in a few months' time.
Thank you, Councillor Moore. We did, though, hear, didn't we, from Mrs. Mather on that subject, that an adopted a plan would have not altered officer's recommendation in this instance. I've got Councillor Vickers. Thank you. Councillor Vickers.
Thank you, Chair. I think I'm sort of feeling a little bit like the others. I mean, it seems to me that it's a site that something needs doing to it, having walked around it, and there's such potential for actually providing community facilities within that site, and I sort of feel hopefully there could be a conversation between the applicant and us, but I can understand the number of objections from local people and from the parish councils. I don't think can be ignored. I think I agree with Councillor Moore that maybe we need to wait a little bit for this referendum. I mean, people go to a lot of trouble to do these neighbourhood plans, and we should respect them. I have a feeling that I would like things to move on. One doesn't want this to be delayed too long. There's been a lot of discussion concern about contamination, but the report actually on this and in other matters says that no development will go ahead until plans have been put forward for how contamination will be dealt with. So there is a lot of protection within the report for some of the things that we've been discussing. So I sort of feel that confident that if we did approve this, that things could be discussed. But I also have a concern about respecting the neighbourhood plan and the fact that we have a referendum coming.
Thank you, Councillor Vickers. Councillor Cant, please.
Thank you, Chair. If it's the right moment, I'd like to second Councillor Alderson's proposal that we should move to vote in support of the officer's recommendations.
That's noted. I've got two other hands which I will take before I put this to the vote. Councillor Cant, and the first of those, Councillor Culver, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Do we need to make sure that we've got all the conditions that we want at this point before we take a vote, with reference to what Mrs. Armour said?
Yes, well, I think Councillor Willison's put his proposal forward with those conditions. He didn't add any other conditions to his proposal.
So am I not allowed to add anything about testing for water contamination and making sure that Mr. Goddard's suggestions about the number of vehicles during school hours, etc. Am I not allowed to add those?
I think you're not allowed to add them, but if Councillor Willison would like to add them to his proposal.
Councillor Williston.
Happy to add them.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Councillor Camp. Sorry, Councillor Culver. Councillor Cole.
Does that include then the informatives? Are they part of what we are about to vote on?
Mrs. Armour?
Yes, they are. I think we need to be very clear. I don't know, do you want Councillor Williston to say what he believes his proposal is again? And then Councillor Cant can say if that's his understanding. Would that be helpful? Or did you want to add something else in terms of informatives?
What else, Councillor Cole, would you have added?
We talked about various informatives during the course of the evening, I seem to remember. What did we have? We had an informative potentially on district heating, for example. On the subjects of looking at community use. Did we have any others?
We had the split of from one bedroom properties to larger properties.
That's subject to the detail.
That's subject to detail, but it is an informative though, isn't it?
Mrs. Armour. Mr. Till, do you want to comment at that point?
Chairman, yes. So in terms of informatives that I've captured in the debate that may be proposed, I've got exploration of community use on site, further exploration of the housing mix to provide more one-bedroom properties, an exploration of the provision of district heating. And I just wanted to check also with Councillor Culver that her proposal to amend the contaminated land condition, condition 18, is to include groundwater testing as well.
And those are the add-ons to the proposal. Councillor Williston, you're content with those?
Content, Chairman.
And the seconder, Councillor Camp.
I'm content with those additions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Till. Mr. Till, is there anything further you'd like to add?
Thank you, Chairman. I would like to note, reiterating a point that was earlier made, that while the referendum may not have been held on the neighbourhood development plan, officers have given it essentially an almost equivalence level of weight in terms of decision making, and therefore I'm satisfied that the recommendation that officers have made would not be altered in terms of the adoption or otherwise of the neighbourhood development plan at this stage.
Thank you very much. And finally, I've got Councillor Rolls.
Yeah, sorry, Chairman. Apologies if this is clearer to other members on the committee, but it's not clear to me. So, Mr. Till, when you say informatives and you mentioned the community piece and the others, what does that mean in terms of conditions when it's an informative? Does that mean that it's going to be explored, discussed, but does that give me comfort that the community will secure some further assets? I'm not quite clear.
Thank you, Chairman. In those terms, an informative is a direction to the applicant. In this particular status, I would suggest, because we're looking at an outline permission, it's a direction to the applicant regarding documentation that they should submit with the reserved matters. So in this case, we would be looking at the exploration of those matters within the reserved matters application, with the applicant demonstrating how they have explored potential further delivery on community use. I should also highlight at this point that it is not a foregone conclusion that members would approve any reserved matters application if they're not satisfied with the proposals that are put forward as part of it.
Councillor Rolls, are you happy with that?
Yes, sorry. Just on the referendum piece, I think it's more about the perception to the public and the timing around that, that we have, whilst you've just informed us that you have taken that into consideration. I just felt that that point needed to be raised because it's more about, as I say, the perception of how important these documents are and the weight that we put upon them. And it just felt a little bit dismissive in terms of the timing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Members, I think, unless I'm greatly mistaken, that we've reached the end of the debate. Very good debate. And we have a proposal from Councillor Wollaston, seconded by Councillor Cant. The recommendation is to delegate to the Service Director for Development and Regulation to grant planning permission, subject conditions, and the completion of Section 106 legal agreement. As I say, I have a proposer and a seconder. I'll take a show of hands, members, please. And against, please.
Okay, is that Councillor Barnett? Is your hand up? Can I do? Yeah. Yes, that's I'm 5.
Okay. So that's defeated. Do I have a counter proposal, please? Councillor Culver, is that that proposal?
Yes. Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I propose that we reject this application. And in terms of reasons, my main reason would be that this contravenes policy CS4. And also, I believe that we should be decontaminating this site before we even think about what else we do with it.
Thank you, Councillor Culver. Does that find a seconder, please? Councillor Barnett, thank you very much. Members, I'll take a show of hands.
Before we do that, can we just make sure that the planning officer's happy with the reasons for refusal? Or
Chairman, the reason offered in respect of CS4, I'm concerned in regard to that CS4 talks about housing mix, and we have advised as officers, members tonight, that the housing mix is something that would be held over to the Reserve Matters application. So I'm concerned that CS4 actually wouldn't hold weight as a refusal reason for this application, because we're looking at a refusal reason that addresses the wrong part of the planning application process and should be held over to the Reserve Matters application if that doesn't provide an appropriate housing mix. Councillor Culver, would you mind expanding on the contaminated land reason for refusal?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Till. As I mentioned, I don't think we should be developing this site until we have dealt with the contamination issue. I don't know about how these situations have been dealt with elsewhere around the country, but surely bearing in mind the amount of evidence we've had for the amount of contamination that we know about and about the fact that there is stuff under the buildings that we cannot access yet, surely we should be dealing with that issue before we even consider anything else.
Thank you, Chairman. In respect of that matter, again, I have concerns that the principal planning legislation and the planning guidance do direct us, the National Planning Policy Framework is what I should mainly be referring to, do direct us to the use of appropriate conditions for addressing issues within planning applications. Now, in this particular case, you have a condition in front of you, recommended, condition 18, that says no phase of the development hereby granted outline planning permission, demolition or groundworks associated with the change of use shall take place until a scheme to deal with the contamination at the site has been submitted and approved in writing by the local planning authority. It states that shall include an investigation and risk assessment, and it further states at point B that it shall include a remediation scheme which ensures that after remediation, as a minimum, the land shall not be capable of being determined as contaminated contaminated land under Part 11A of the Environmental Protection Act 1990. So I am concerned that there is a condition in front of you that seeks to fully address the decontamination of the site and all outputs from that decontamination, and that if refusing on grounds of the site not being fully decontaminated prior to development works commencing, then that is exactly what the condition in front of you seeks to do.
Thank you, Mr. Till. Mrs. Armour, please.
Yeah, sorry, I sort of meant if we could maybe assist you with some of the reasons for refusal. For example, the first reason for refusal you've stated, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, because Mr. Till's obviously said as originally sort of proposed, it might not actually be a good reason for refusal. And I don't know if we fully captured your concerns. So maybe if you expand your concerns a bit more, and then perhaps Mr. Till can assist you with how those might be addressed in an appropriate reason for refusal.
Sorry, Councillor Culver, is your microphone on?
Mr. Chairman, if Mr. Till thinks that CS4 and the contamination are not appropriate, it also contravenes the existing local plan, which says there should only be 140 homes on the site.
So is your concern over development?
Yes.
And Mr. Till, then, does that give you anything
Chairman,
to go forward with?
Certainly the supplementary planning document allocating this site and the emerging Compton neighbourhood development plan both state that the site should provide approximately 140 houses, and the proposal on the table is 160 houses. Members may well consider that there are reasons that 160 houses is not acceptable in this particular case. However, I would appreciate if members could advise the particular concerns, for example, landscape impact or additional impact on highways that might lead to those concerns with the uplift in housing resulting in harm.
Councillor Culver, do you want to come back on that?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think with regard to the vehicles, we've heard this evening about how much impact it's going to have on Compton and how much impact it's going to have on East Ilsley as well. We're going to have all of that demolition traffic coming through, then the construction traffic. We've heard about how close the houses are to the road in East Ilsley. We're going to have all of those vehicles going past. I don't think it's appropriate to have such a large development, which is a 25% increase in the size of that village, when the demolition and construction traffic has to pass through small one-lane blind bends, basically, and we have a lot of school buses, a lot of existing vehicles. And also, I think there's an argument, we didn't really touch on it particularly tonight in any great detail. I think Councillor Barnett raised about the impact on the doctor's surgery, impact on infrastructure, the impact on the primary school, the secondary school, the doctor's surgery, etc. We haven't got the infrastructure in that village that we need to support a 25% increase.
Thank you, Councillor Culver. Mrs. Mailer, you've been waiting very patiently and you're back in again. Over to you, please. You're muted, I'm afraid.
Sorry, thank you. Just on the infrastructure, obviously that the things which have been mentioned are covered by the community infrastructure levy.
Thank you very much. Mr. Till, I'm going to look across to you again. Do you have anything meaningful there that you can get your teeth stuck into?
I'm still a little concerned in respect of the justification for highways movements associated with this demolition and construction activities. The allocation is for 140.
Chairman, can I just raise a point of order, if you don't mind?
Councillor Rolls.
We've had extensive debate on all these issues. we have a motion, we have a proposal put forward, I feel like there's seemingly quite a lot of sort of pressure coming from officers to, I understand the need to have the reasons so that this doesn't go to appeal, for example, and is challenged, and obviously that is costs involved for the council and everything else. But you know, at the end of the day, this feels like we are being sort of that there seems to be sort of I don't know what it is, but sort of officers' slightly defensive points that are a little bit excessive when we've actually explored all these points. We are a committee. We are here to make independent decision that we feel is right. And I just feel a bit pressurised at the moment by officers who seem to be having the floor to defend any points that are put forward by members who are trying to make a proposal.
We have to send our soldiers into battle armed, at least. Councillor, Mrs. Armour.
Sorry, I just wanted to interject. I too am very reluctant to enter into debate when we've got a proposal.
Thank you.
However, I do think that we do need to understand the reasons for refusal. And given that it's against officer's recommendation, I think Mr. Till needs to understand those reasons. And I think my point about asking him to come in was that he needs to be clear what the reasons for refusal is, because he's got to set it out and set out the policies. And that's where I was coming from. And that's where the line of questioning is going from. So I just wanted really to clarify that point.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Armour. Councillor Culver, I'm going to come back to you as your proposer.
Should we hear from other members with respect, Chairman? We have 3 other members who have their hands raised. I think
I'm very reluctant to go into debate. I think what needs to be done is if Mr. Till could maybe summarise what he thinks the reasons for refusal are, both yourself and Councillor Barnett confirm whether that's your understanding, and then we can take the matter to the vote.
Mr. Till.
Thank you, Chairman. We have reasons for refusal in respect of a conflict with policy CS4 of the core strategy associated with the housing mix, and a reason for refusal in respect of the contamination of land on the site. I'm sorry, I still need to understand what the concern is specifically in respect of that one, and in respect of the developments of the site, that it would be contrary to the supplementary planning document and neighbourhood development plan requirement for approximately 140 houses, which would result in harm to highway safety and the amenity of residential occupants due to vehicle movements associated with construction traffic arising from the demolition and redevelopment of the site.
Mr. Till, I've got 2 hands. I'll take them very, very quickly. Councillor Moore.
Thank you, Chairman. Just two comments. The first one is that with every sympathy for the residents of Compton and East Ilsley, in terms of demolition, that movement will happen anyway. Even if the community, the hostel is retained, that's a minor point. So those movements will have to happen to clear the site. And the difference in terms of construction traffic between 140 and 160 seems to be fairly minimal. Can I make a counter proposal that we defer?
There's already a proposal on the table that's been seconded, so we'll see what happens with that proposal.
Thank you, Councillor Moore. Councillor Culver.
To my mind, this has all been about the neighbourhood development plan being ignored by officers. Like Councillor Rolls, I feel that we are being railroaded, and I don't accept that this committee should be publicly railroaded by officers. I'm very unhappy about this. However, we do need to do something. To my mind, it's nothing to do with construction traffic. The village has a neighbourhood development plan, and the village views it should be 140. We have not heard anything to suggest that it should be more than 140. There's no justification for it. We haven't dealt with the infrastructure. So if you're looking for reasons, the highways reasons relate to traffic in terms of the long-term residents of the site, not the construction. It's not unreasonable to look at the doctor's surgery, other aspects of infrastructure. We haven't really talked about it, but we've certainly heard elsewhere that the doctor's surgery doesn't have capacity. I wouldn't use schools as a reason.
Councillor Culver, we have a proposal on the table.
You're looking for reasons.
We have a proposal, and unless Councillor Culver is prepared to alter that.
Yeah, I'm happy if Councillor Cole wants to add to what I've said in terms of reasoning.
Add or replace?
What would you replace?
Traffic, without any question. Remove construction traffic and replace with long-term residential traffic.
Okay.
Okay. I'm going to put this to the vote. Members, Mrs. Armour?
Yeah, so is everyone very clear what they're voting on in terms of the reasons for refusal?
Could you actually just recap, Mrs. Mather, so we have a full summary?
Mr. Till, do you want to?
Thank you, Councillor Ross. The reasons for refusal that I have in front of me are that the proposed development would be contrary to the supplementary planning policy, supplementary planning document and neighbourhood development plan in respect of delivering more than 140 dwellings. My apologies, sorry. The reasons for refusal I have in front of me are that the proposed development would be contrary to the supplementary planning document and neighbourhood development plan in terms of the number of dwellings proposed, and this would result in additional impacts on infrastructure and in particular disruption due to increased amounts of long-term residential traffic, resulting in harm to residential amenity and highway safety, and that the proposed works would not address contamination prior to would not address contamination at a suitable point in relation to development. And that the proposed housing mix would be contrary to the requirements of policy CS4.
Thank you very much. Mr. Goddard, the last minute.
Sorry, Chairman, I'm just wanting to understand what the highway issues here. Is it during construction or is it post-construction when the development's completed?
I think that's been covered, hasn't it? When both Councillor Cole's comments earlier, it's going to be residential traffic rather than construction.
That was my understanding. Okay, we have a thank you very much.
All right, okay, I'll say no more.
Thank you, Mr. Goddard. We have a proposal from Councillor Culver, seconded by Councillor Barnett. Members in favour of the proposal, please. If you make your hands clear, please, officers struggling to see. 4. And those against?
2, 3, 4.
That leaves 1 over. Abstention, Councillor Moore. Thank you very much. Okay. We have
So we need another.
A stalemate.
No, because you're the casting vote. You've got the casting vote. So it's been refused.
So it's been refused. That proposal has been, that's been refused. Where does that leave us now?
Another proposal needs to be made.
Okay. Members, another proposal, please. Councillor Wollaston.
Chair, may I suggest we defer this until our post of the local development plan.
That finds a second. Thank you, Councillor Wollaston. That finds a second. Councillor Moore. Members.
To defer this application until after the Compton Neighbourhood Development Plan has had its referendum.
Thank you, Councillor Wollaston. That's been seconded by Councillor Moore. Members, I'll take a show of hands, please. Physical hands, please. And that is unanimous. Members, thank you very much. With your permission, members, hopefully the final item is a technicality and a quick one. I'm looking around the room to our officers. I will propose a motion under Rule 7.6.2 to continue this meeting and conclude business by 10:30 and no later. Does that find a seconder, please? Councillor Wisdom, thank you very much. Members, a show of hands in favour? Thank you very much. We shall adjourn for 2 minutes for a quick comfort break, and then we will be back here no later than 9:45. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Karimi. Members, welcome back. Okay, moving on. Item number 4, 21/01911 land adjoining 11 Pond Close, Newbury. I'm going to go straight to our presenting officer, Mr. Simon Till.
Thank you, Chairman. Members, this application is for the removal of derelict garages and erection of 2 houses and 2 flats. The committee considered this application on the 3rd of November 2021 and resolved to refuse it for the 2 reasons set out in your report. The application is sited within the defined settlement boundary of Newbury in Pond Close, a residential cul-de-sac. The principle of development for new housing is considered acceptable and there are no objections from consultees. Representations on this application include 14 letters of objection setting out concerns with narrow roads, impacts on emergency vehicles, parking issues, highways, pedestrian safety, overdevelopment, character and appearance of the area, ecological impacts, environmental impacts, impacts on residents' mental health, waste collection, health and safety and overlooking. Members, at the meeting on the 3rd of November, albeit contrary to officer's recommendation, in giving its resolution, the committee set out clear reasons in terms of highway safety, general amenity and existing parking constraints to support the first reason for refusal. However, in terms of the second reason for refusal, officers raised concerns that this was based on a misinterpretation of planning policy in terms of seeking zero carbon energy on a minor development. Since the meeting on the 3rd of November, planning policy has provided a more comprehensive advice based on the Council's legal opinion regarding the application of policy CS15 of the core strategy on sustainable construction and energy use. The relevant excerpts of this advice are set out in your agenda report at section 6. These are as follows. At local policy level, policy CS15 does not provide a policy basis on which residential development can be required to meet zero carbon construction standard. Rather, in respect of residential development construction standards, CS15 is out of date, inconsistent with the MPPF and of little, if any, weight. And furthermore, there is no policy basis on which the Council could lawfully require residential development to come forward on a zero carbon basis. At present, the Council will have to rely upon the building regulations regime delivering development which accords with the national technical standards. The report goes on to confirm that the requirements of policy for zero carbon energy only apply to major residential development, that being for 10 houses or more, or for residential development of over 0.5 hectares. Neither of these criteria apply in this case, as the development proposed is for under 10 dwellings and on a site area of less than 0.5 hectares. Members, in light of the above, your planning officer's recommendation is for a refusal on the basis of the first reason for refusal stated at point 1.5 of the report and the omission of the second reason for refusal stated at 1.6 of the report. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Till. Over to you, Mr. Goddard, please, from a highways point of view.
Well, thank you, Chairman. Basically, if reason 2 is withdrawn, and that only leaves reason 1 for highways, I don't want members to feel that I'm pushing back after the last debate, but I did express concerns when the application was refused on highway grounds. And if that is now becomes the only reason for refusal, then that does add to my concerns being the only reason left standing. I would contend that there are also policy issues. Part of the wording of the reason for refusal detailed the parking that was lost on the site for residents, but the parking was lost some years ago when the land was sold, and the council doesn't have any policies to protect parking facilities like that from what is a private land transaction. I also mentioned that there were no highway reasons before for when planning applications were refused on this site for schemes that were larger, actually larger than the scheme that was presented to you on the 3rd of November. A third point that I would make is that it's been refused on parking grounds, but the proposal more than complied with the council's parking standards. And the fourth and final point that I would make, and then I will say no more, is it was refused on access. Now, if there were no improvement works to Pond Close, then I would understand that. But they are widening Pond Close to overcome the issues for about 2/3 of the frontage of the site. So that does reiterate my concerns about this reason for refusal, which would be highlighted even more if it's the only reason for refusal left standing. But in saying that, if the refusal stands, then I must respect your decision, and I will do all that I can to defend the reason for refusal. I'm not pretending it will be easy for the reasons I pointed out, but we will do what I can to get the desired result that members expressed at the committee on the 3rd of November. Thank you. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goddard. Before I go on to our extremely patient member of the Newbury Town Council, Mrs. Armour, please.
Yes, sorry, I just wanted to clarify for members, following what Mr. Goddard said, is that we're here tonight to debate and discuss the removal of the second reason for refusal. The report has not been designed with the information to enable you to go to any great discussion about reason one. So the aim of the report is to focus on the refusal reason two. I hope that assists members.
Thank you very much for clearing that up, Mrs. Armour. Now, finally, Councillor Nigel Foot, who's been sat there waiting all evening, engrossed in the goings-on. If you'd turn on your microphone, Councillor Foot.
Thank you very much.
5 minutes when you start speaking, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Yes, this application has come before Newbury Town Council Planning and Highways Committee, and we objected to it on the grounds of overdevelopment of the site, the parking issues, which have been outlined already, and we were concerned about the limitation of emergency vehicle access to this road. We felt that with the proposed developments, new cars were going to be arriving, that those inhabiting those houses would have visitors, and this would increase the difficulty of access to that road. And we know of emergency vehicles that have not been able to go down that road because of cars that are parked already. I'd be very happy to answer any questions the committee might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Foot. Members, any questions of the councillor, please? No, I think that is that. If you'd be good enough, thank you, Councillor Foot, turn off your microphone and take your seat. Thank you very much indeed. Members, clarification questions of our officers, please. Do you have anything you'd like to ask? Nothing at all? Okay, then I move this on to the debate. Who'd like to start me off on that? Councillor Vickers.
Thank you. I would simply like to propose the officers' recommendations, please. Thank you.
Short and sweet. Thank you, Councillor Vickers. Councillor Cole.
I would like to second that recommendation.
Thank you very much indeed. That is noted. Members, is there anything you'd like to offer as far as the debate's concerned, or are we done on this? Councillor Barnett.
Sorry, I was going to question actually, Mr. Goddard, but I mean, I'm still rather concerned regarding this is access. There might be some improvements in the road in a certain area close to where the proposed development is, but the concern still is this pinch point and the access leading off of Elizabeth Avenue, and that will remain, and that will be a major issue, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. Councillor Moore.
Very briefly, just to say thank you to the officers for the arguments presented. It's disappointing, but at least we know where we are on that. Thank you.
Very much indeed. Members, are you done on that? Very short debate. Thank you very much. I have a proposal from Councillor Vickers, seconded by Councillor Cole, that the Service Director for Development and Regulation grant permission. Can I take? I do apologise. Thank you very much. That would have been interesting, wouldn't it? Thank you very much, Mrs. Armour. Refuse. Proposed by Councillor Vickers, seconded by Councillor Cole. Members, a show of hands, please. Oh no, actually no. I'm abstaining. So take my hand down. Thank you.
So okay, because people put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
And against. That's 2 against and 1 abstention. Very nearly fell at the final hurdle there, but didn't. Thank you very much, members. Another long night. If you'd please remain seated until the broadcast's taken down. And then when we're done, if you'd wipe your desks down, please. Members, thank you very much and good night.